Chapter 361. 10 days was not a long time for cultivators. Han Yan's daily routine was the same. Every day, she would gather crabs with her sisters and cultivate as usual. She was not afraid of death, but it did not mean that she wanted to die. After understanding the sect's intention, she was also very afraid, but she would not back down. She hoped that the sect could safely get through this, and she also hoped that she could be safe. However, all of this did not seem to be up to her. In these few days, more and more cultivators came from various small and medium-sized sects in Arai. Their composition was complicated, but she could feel that most of them had hope for this battle. They hoped that the battle between Kuan-Dao World and Weijin Mountain would succeed. This would also point out a path for them in the future. The three Pure Ones did not have many allies. They were very confident in the outcome of this battle. In a world of self-cultivators, confidence was built on strength. After tens of thousands of years of living together, many things were not difficult to guess and could be seen at a glance. Han Yin and the other 7 cultivators were assigned to a group. They were prepared to receive the cultivators of the 3 Pure Ones and Weijin Mountain. They were actually all participants. One group had 4 people in 2 groups. One group was for normal battles while the other group had secret techniques and was prepared to die together. Different sects had different methods for the upcoming opponents. Some would choose not to meet before the battle. Some would be willing to understand more about the opponent, and some would completely ignore them. This was related to the orthodoxy's battle preference. There was no better method. Kuan-Dao World did not have as much killing intent as the other orthodoxies, so they walked the path of understanding more. This was the reason why the 8 of them came out in advance. In any case, it was the benefit of being the host. What Han Yin was most concerned about was not these, but the 3 sisters who were prepared to sacrifice themselves like her. She was not familiar with them, but she could see that these 3 sisters were real humans. They were fearless of death like her. They were curious about each other, but they did not probe each other. They respected each other's space. Cultivators talked about the state of mind. In a sense, the state of mind was a kind of psychology. For a person who was willing to sacrifice himself, this was a process of continuous self-hypnosis, self-improvement, self-encouragement, and self-deepening. When a few people who were willing to sacrifice themselves really gathered together, communicated with each other, told each other about their experiences, and poured out their worries. This was going to be bad. Most likely, they would have this thought, so there is someone who is more bitter than me. If that's the case, why should I? The state of mind was a wonderful thing. Even if you were willing, even if you had already made up your mind, you still needed skills to maintain this kind of willpower. As long as you were a living creature, you would have the will to live. It was impossible to maintain a state of fighting to the death forever. This was also the reason why the sect had only informed them at the very last moment. If the notice was given months or years in advance, the waiting time alone was enough to drive people crazy. He ran away. He was terrified. He was only at the foundation establishment stage. He still had a long way to go in terms of mental toughness. There were still 3 days before the official start of the battle. The cultivators of the 3 Pure Ones arrived on a boat. There were more than 20 of them, and they were led by 3 Jin Dan cultivators. Among the remaining cultivators, it was unknown who would participate in the battle and who would not. With a simple move, the experienced and ruthless Dharma Meridians destroyed the illusion of the Kuan-Dao cultivators leaving the boundary to sense their opponents in advance. In this aspect, they were the teachers, and the Kuan-Dao cultivators were the students. In this battle, the great cultivators from both sides would not appear. They would stop at the Jindan. This was also a tacit understanding between everyone. The cultivators of the 3 Pure Ones were arranged into a group of individual guest houses. The Jindan elders of the Kuan-Dao separation boundary decisively stopped their own disciples from coming into contact with each other. This kind of contact with an unknown target would instead cause suspicion among the disciples, affect their judgment, and shake their determination. It was better not to do it. There was another reason. That afternoon, the swordsmen of Weijin Mountain arrived. A Jin Dan led 5 swordsmen, not one more, not one less. This was the style of the sword vein. It was completely different from that of the Dharma meridians. The Kuan Dao separation boundary's welcome was low-key and sincere. Towards true friends, of course, there was a way to be friends. Han Yin followed her sisters and brought the swordsman to the most beautiful water cloud pavilion on Fangting Island. From now on, they were close comrades. In the cruelty of the battle arena, everyone's performance was very important. They needed to understand each other in order to display their greatest battle strength. For tens of thousands of years, the Kuan Dao separation boundary had been very close to Weijin Mountain. This kind of closeness was not because of how many of their disciples had become Dao companions. This was only one aspect. It was also because of many specific things in cultivation. For example, the pills and floating rafts that the Kuan Dao separation boundary was most proficient in would be sent to Weijin Mountain. This allowed the swordsman who was clumsy in these aspects to benefit greatly. However, not every Kuan Dao disciple had contact with swordsmen. After all, their orthodoxies were different and their philosophies were different. It was impossible for them to cultivate together. Other than some special Kuan Dao cultivators who often had contact with swordsmen, the others had long heard of swordsmen but were actually unfamiliar with them. For example, Han Yin had never come into contact with a swordsman. This made her a little curious. What were these people who fought all day and dealt with death made of? Did they not look forward to a stable and peaceful cultivation life and live a carefree life in happiness? The 5 swordsmen each had their own characteristics. One was forthright and iron-blooded. One was cold and heartless. One was calm and composed. One was elegant and refined. And one was fresh and looked around like a curious baby. Han Yin was not human, so she especially trusted her intuition. She could feel in the eyes of this curious baby that he liked the surrounding natural environment from the bottom of his heart. This made her accept him at the first moment. This person was very young, and his cultivation level was the lowest among the 5 swordsmen. In fact, he was also the lowest among the 10 cultivators present who could participate in the battle. He was only in the middle stage of foundation establishment. Each orthodoxy had their own way of determining a cultivator's age and cultivation base. If the other party did not deliberately conceal it, this was also not a difficult matter. Therefore, Han Yin was able to determine that this young sword cultivator was the youngest among the cultivators present. His cultivation base was also the lowest. He was so young that under normal sex, this kind of disciple should only have some success in his studies and should be traveling everywhere to increase his knowledge. This kind of young cultivator was actually very unsuitable to participate in this kind of battle. If his cultivation level was insufficient, it would inevitably affect his strength. If he did not have enough knowledge, he would lack experience. However, this was not something she should consider. Weisor Mountain was not like the 3 pure ones. They only had 5 swordsmen here, which meant that he would definitely participate in the battle. She hoped that this young swordsman would not be young and hot-blooded and lose his life here in a moment of impulse. She was willing to sacrifice herself because this was her home. However, this young swordsman did not need to sacrifice himself. A trace of pity floated in her heart, and she walked over. "What is your name? Being able to work for the sect at such a young age, you will definitely be a pillar of the sect in the future." The young swordsman looked back. His eyes, which had been filled with nature, were immediately replaced by a beautiful woman. She replaced him very quickly. Nature. However, the words that came out of his mouth made Han Yin unable to guess. Coming out to work at such a young age, it could also be that the master is destroying child labor. He might not be a pillar of the sect, but he is definitely being used as a good-for-nothing now. How should I address you, little sister? This one is Waysword Mountain's Fei Chai. It is fate that we meet today. Chapter 362. Han Yin was stunned. How could she not hear the dissatisfaction in the young swordsman's tone? This should not be something a loyal disciple would say to the sect. Or was he just not satisfied with working for Boatingting Island? If the swordsman sent by Weijin Mountain had this kind of mentality, then it was not easy to answer this kind of question, so she could only change the topic. The sect has its own considerations, right? As disciples, we can't make wild guesses about these things. I'm Han Yen. Thank you for everything Wei Jin Mountain has done for our Koan Dao. Fei Chai curled his lips. The sect's considerations? It's just that there's selfishness in the official business. If we as disciples don't think more, we won't even know if we're sold out. Han Yen, this name is really faded. You don't have to thank Wei Jin Mountain. It's more practical to thank us unlucky people directly. Han Yen finally understood what was going on. She was hinting that she wanted benefits. Directly? Practically? What did that mean? If it was just spirit stones, the sect would not be stingy, and she would not be stingy. But what if it was something else? For example, some unreasonable and excessive requests? She knew very well that although Wei Jin Mountain had always been the most staunch ally of the Koan Dao Li Jie, and most of the swordsman's personal morals were unquestionable, this did not mean that there were no black sheep in Wei Jin Mountain. Not to mention Wei Jin Mountain, even Xianyuan was the same. When there were many people, there would be all kinds of birds. There were precedents to follow. The initial good impression had disappeared, but the Koan Dao disciple who paid attention to personal quality would not show all this on her face. She still asked softly, "If junior martial brother Fei Chai has any requests, you can tell me. Han Yin will do her best. If you can't do it, there's still the sect's help. What's so difficult about it?" She was hinting that if he made any excessive requests, she would report it to the sect. Fei Chai's eyes lit up. "I've been dealing with wine and meat every day in Wei Jin Mountain. It's all wine and meat barrels. I really can't stand it. Senior sister, do you have any bland, sweet, and sour food? Do you have candied haws?" Han Yan's heart softened. The ill will that originally welled up disappeared without a trace. This was clearly a child that had not yet grown up. His will was not strong, and he was still infatuated with the candied haws that even mortals would only eat as children. Of course, they didn't have candied haws here, but that didn't mean they couldn't make it. For those who loved to cook, this was not a difficult task at all. "Wait here, I'll go make some for you." Han Yin floated away, leaving Fei Chai smacking his lips. This unlucky name doesn't sound good at all. He got a cigarette, but in Xianyuan and a Fei Chai in Wei Jin Mountain. Was this his fate? Lu Xiaoyi was too absorbed in his cultivation at the dome, so he forgot to go down the mountain to buy some fresh sugar-coated haws before he left. It was better to eat it fresh. Although it was not spoiled after being stored in the storage ring for a few years, it always tasted wrong. After all, marinated braised meat was different from fresh fruit with syrup, so the shelf life was different. When he came to Wei Jin Mountain, it was truly a bandit's den. It was even more excessive than Xianyuan. They were very enthusiastic and ate fish and meat every day. They were not happy until they were drunk. This was the style of Wei Jin Mountain. They did not hide it, but where could he find candied haws in such a place? Time was tight, so he came to Fannying Island. He thought that the food in such a beautiful place would not be too greasy. Not long after, Han Yin floated back. Because it was too rushed, she only made 10 sticks of candied haws. Fei Chai carefully took one stick and put it in his mouth with a look of enjoyment. Han Yin sighed. It was really worrisome. She did not know why the Wei Sword Mountain sent such a young sword cultivator. Delicious. It's really delicious. It's better than all the candied haws I've eaten in the past few decades. Lu Xiaoyi praised. This was the truth because the candied haws here were not the same as the ones outside. Han Yin said softly, "Ocean Emperor honey and ice silk fruit. The candied haws made from them are naturally different from the ones in the mortal world. The fresh ingredients in the kitchen are limited, so I only made 10 sticks." Seeing Lu Xiaoyi carefully put the remaining 9 candied haws into his storage ring with a reluctant look on his face, he couldn't help but chuckle. "Junior brother Fei Chai, eat a few more. When the battle is over and we win, I'll go gather more ingredients for you. I'll make sure you have enough." Lu Xiaoyi laughed. "Only when we win. If we lose, there won't be any? You can't judge a hero based on victory or defeat, right? Who hasn't lost before? Life has to go on." Han Yin sighed. It was good to be young and carefree. However, if this was Wei Jin Mountain's crisis, would he still be able to maintain this childlike innocence? If he lost, Of course there wouldn't be any because that would mean she was no longer here. Maybe the other sisters could help him? Lu Xiaoyi counted with his fingers and sighed with satisfaction. 1 stick per match, 9 sticks per match. Just right, this is a good omen. The Foundation establishment cultivators were waiting, but the Jindan still had to solve the problem of how to arrange the troops. At this time, the 3 pure ones had basically figured out the details of the cultivators, and the situation was not optimistic. A fellow Taoist who had a deep relationship with the 3 pure ones said that among the nearly 20 Foundation establishment cultivators, there were some true powerhouses that the 3 pure ones had always kept a secret. Although they did not know which 9 of the 3 pure ones would send out in the end, the situation was very obvious. Those who came did not come with good intentions. Kuindao Jindan silently selected the people for the second plan, but he could not say this. If he did, it would be disrespectful to the swordsmen of Weijin Mountain, so he could only do it silently. However, the information about the cultivators of the 3 pure ones still accurately reached the ears of Weijin Mountain's Jindan and Taoist Yinyi. 9 people. What does Taoist Yinyi think about the arrangement? In this kind of battle, the vanguard and the arena master were very important. The vanguard needed to win the battle to raise morale, and the arena master needed to ensure the final victory. Of course, the most important thing was definitely the arena master and vice-arena master. This was the key to success or failure. Yinyi did not consider the battle prowess of the cultivators of Kun Daoli world. After being together for tens of thousands of years, who did not know each other's background, they were actually here to be bystanders, so all the burden would be placed on Weijin Mountain. Swordsmen were of course not afraid of pressure. The greater the pressure, the more passionate they would be. Therefore, Yinyi was actually only considering the arrangement of the 5 swordsmen. There was a problem here. The external sword from Xianyuan was too young, and his cultivation was not enough. His swordsmanship was probably not that strong. Weijin Mountain admired Xianyuan very much, but they only admired the internal sword. They had never put Xuanyuan's external sword in their eyes. Even so, there were some things that needed to be considered. For example, no matter how bad Xuanyuan's external sword was, it was supported by Xuanyuan's name and could not be ignored. This represented the problem of the sect status. Perhaps Xianyuan was far away and did not know that this matter was getting bigger and bigger, so they sent such a young swordsman to learn. Only the disciples of Weijin Mountain were truly trustworthy. My Weijin Mountain will fight for the 1st, 2nd, 7th, 8th, and 9th battle. The rest will be arranged by Kuindao. Daoist friend, what do you think? Chapter 363. P.S. Mei, you have to know that this old man is old and can't resist anymore. Yinyi's plan was very simple. Xianyuan and Wei Jianshan would each occupy one position. He was afraid that Xuanyuan's external sword wouldn't be strong enough, so he arranged his side's most suitable vanguard for the second match. He thought they would be able to recover the lost morale. The remaining 3 swordsmen would be the last to defend the arena. As for the Kuindao cultivators, they couldn't count on them too much. If they could defeat one, it wouldn't be bad. If they could defeat 2, it would be a victory. Kuindao Jindan was very clear about what he meant, but in terms of battle, Kuindao cultivators really didn't have any right to speak. After 10,000 years, these bloody things were done by the sword vein, so they were already used to it. Their plan was not to rely on numbers to defeat 1 or 2 opponents, but to destroy all 4 of them. However, there was no need to say these words. Even the weak had dignity. Fei Chai, you're first in line. I'm only 3rd. It's not easy to be the vanguard. This means that Martial Uncle Yin Yi thinks highly of you. In fact, I think that you don't need to take this too seriously. There are still 8 martial brothers and sisters behind you. It doesn't matter whether you win or lose. After 2 days of getting along, Han Yin was somewhat familiar with this young swordsman. She didn't want such a young life to be destroyed here, so she gave him a chance to vent his pressure. Lu Xiaoyi was very angry. He had to be the vanguard again. Nothing good could escape from him. How could he live like this? I don't want to be the vanguard. I want to be the champion, Han Yin chuckled. It's not easy to be the champion. You need to take responsibility. Fei Chai, are you that confident in yourself? Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. How could I be confident? The only reason I want to be the champion is because I can win without fighting. Isn't it good to save energy? I'm very good at cheering people on. I'm also good at scolding people. Generally, no one can scold me. I'm very talented in this area. Han Yin was once again speechless. The way this junior swordsman spoke was very strange, but she knew that he didn't have any bad intentions. He just liked to complain, complaining that the heavens were unfair and the earth was unfair. He was a little lazy. It doesn't matter. If you can't beat them, then retreat. With your middle stage cultivation, no one will say anything if you retreat. Marshal Uncle you won't blame you either, right? Just treat it as accumulating experience. If you have any grudges, I'll avenge you. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. This silly girl was so innocent that she was cute. Where could he retreat to? There was no retreat. Xuan Yuan's curtain was covering his face. How could he retreat? Yi wouldn't say anything to him because it wasn't his business. However, it was hard to say what would happen when he returned to Xinyuan. A large group of people were waiting to send him missions to torture him. Thank you, senior sister. However, there is no need for senior sister to take revenge. But after the battle, I would like to tour the scenery of Tinghai. I wonder if senior sister could show me the way? Han Yan's heart was sour. How could she still have a future? She was the third to go on stage because the sect thought highly of her innate ability. She was extremely confident that she could complete the Tonggue attack. This was to express her determination to leave the realm. Not only her, but the other three sisters as well. Their mission was to use their own lives to pave the way for the last swordsman to defend the arena. Death was certain. She had never lied in her life, but this time she couldn't tell the truth. All right, I promise you. At the Three Pure Ones guest house, the three Jin Dan confirmed the final name list. As expected, the ones who went up were the strongest. Dharma cultivators were all stubborn old men. They stuck to the rules and treated the rules as more important than the heavens. Therefore, their ranking was actually very simple. It was based on strength from the weakest to the strongest. It seems stupid, but in the face of strength, it was the best method. One of the three pure Jin Dan Taoists flicked his finger, indicating for everyone to pay attention. Using a butcher's knife to kill a chicken is the main theme of our Three Pure Ones actions this time. Tell me, if there is an accident, where will it happen? The 9 Foundation establishment cultivators looked at each other, starting from the strongest arena master. Abnormalities in the small space of the battle, mutual return technique, internal sword infiltration. The Foundation establishment cultivators thought about it very thoroughly. The 3 pure Jin Dan nodded in satisfaction. This was how battles should be. There was no fear in battle, but before the battle, one had to consider all possible scenarios. Only then could one have a comprehensive response. Swordsmen were not afraid of death. The 3 pure ones could also find disciples who were willing to contribute to the sect. Once one reached the Foundation establishment realm, one had to start building one's Tao heart. How did one build one's Tao heart? It was through constant life and death experiences that swordsmen understood this point. How could the Dharma cultivators not understand it? It was just that there were more ways for the Dharma cultivators to build their Tao heart, while swordsmen only had the same method of life and death. In comparison, swordsmen were more unafraid of death. Everyone was afraid of death. The key was who could persist in pretending not to be afraid of death the longest. This was the truth of swordsmen's fearlessness. In this aspect, the Dharma cultivators were slowly catching up. They might never be able to pretend to be swordsmen, but if the gap between them narrowed and supplemented with other methods, the swordsman's so-called restraint over the Dharma cultivators was slowly disappearing. This was what the 3 pure ones have been doing for tens of thousands of years. They had analyzed the advantages of the swordsmen over the Dharma cultivators countless times and realized that there were very few things that really depended on the characteristics of the technique and more on the mentality. Thus, they went straight to the point. There's no need to worry about the small space of the battle. This is the 3 pure one strength. If we don't do anything, then no one can do anything. There's no need to worry about Xinyuan. They can't interfere in this battle. If the 5 external swords all come from Xian Yuan, then it's good news for you, not bad news. But there's one point. Regarding the art of mutual return, Marshal Nephew Gao Yang's opinion is very insightful. But in my opinion, the swordsman's art of mutual return cannot change the outcome. The only thing that can change the outcome is the art of mutual return of the Kuan Dao cultivators. If the Kuan Dao cultivators are no longer their weakness, then this battle will truly become a battle between the 3 pure ones and the Weijian Mountain. I believe that we can win, but it will be tragic. I don't want it to come to that. Another Jin Dan also smiled and said, through certain channels, we also vaguely know that the 4 Kuan Dao cultivators from the Kuan Dao realm are not simple. They may have some kind of secret technique that can achieve a certain level of mutual destruction. We don't know the specific technique, but the general strategy will not be wrong. Regarding this, you have to be mentally prepared. The 3 pure ones were speechless. How could they be prepared? Fighting methods like mutual destruction were the ultimate fighting methods used by cultivators when they were forced into a corner. It was often accompanied by some kind of mystery that was difficult to guard against. If they were constantly on guard against this, then there was no need for the battle arena. How much of their strength could they use? Of course, guarding against the opponent's life and death struggle was also one of the cultivators' fighting abilities. You couldn't say that this fighting method was against the rules, but it was more extreme. The key point was that the common cultivators who were forced into mutual destruction were not the same concept as the ones who were specially selected out of thousands of foundation establishment cultivators to do so. This must be because they had some kind of mysterious ability and a special confidence. This kind of exchange didn't mean much in a battle between cultivators, because killing 1,000 of the enemy would cause 1,000 of your own to suffer 1,000 losses. It couldn't change the direction of the battle. But in this kind of battle arena system, its power was endless. You can't run. Chapter 364. P.S. Brat, why are you joining in the fun? Do you believe that I will give you a reverse corner and let little E train you to death? Finally, the leader, Jin Dan, coughed lightly. All right, don't scare them anymore. We already have a way to perish together with the Kuan Dao realm, and that is to start in the battle space. This time, the battle space will be provided by a third party, the Tai Heaven sect. We will make arrangements to add 2 auxiliary spaces in the battle space. All the participating cultivators will wait in the auxiliary spaces. This is for the fairness of both sides. There will be no interference or guidance from outside cultivators. Everything will depend on oneself. A foundation establishment cultivator still did not quite understand. Marshal Uncle, is there any special function? The leader, Jin Dan, said righteously, what function? Of course, it will not be of any help to you. Don't think about reaping without sowing. We, the 3 pure ones, are open and above board. We will never do such sneaky things. If you want to win and win glory for the sect, you can only rely on your own true abilities. This is the foundation of the 3 pure ones, the source of our inheritance. He was blowing his beard and glaring at them to show his nobility. Next to him, Jin Dan chuckled. You must understand what senior martial brother means. Being open and above board has always been the symbol of the 3 pure ones. You must never forget it. The auxiliary space is mainly used to accommodate you participating disciples. It can make the battle more continuous and compact, and it will not be disturbed by the outside world. Of course, it also has an auxiliary function. It can spread the mysterious lock of a cultivator to everyone in the space. The foundation establishment cultivators understood tacitly. For example, some special techniques of mutual destruction were usually used when one was on the verge of death. The idea was to pull someone away. Most of these secret techniques had a common characteristic, and that was the problem of how to lock onto the opponent. Of course, they would not use ordinary methods to lock onto the opponent. This was because when a cultivator was forced to this point, their magic power and spirit would definitely be on the verge of collapse. Otherwise, they would not risk their lives. Basically, The method used was to mysteriously lock onto the opponent. At the cost of one's life, this mysterious power was used to make the targeted person have nowhere to escape, especially in such a closed battle space. The original space was only occupied by the two of them. Once it was locked on, there was nowhere to run. However, if there were 18 cultivators in the space, including the ancillary space, and one of them used the mutual destruction technique, the mysterious lock-on would become 17 targets. In that case, it would be more like suicide. Jean Dan reminded them again. Not every method of mutual destruction relies on a mysterious lock. There are countless unimaginable secret methods in the cultivation world, and there must be other methods. However, an occasional example will not affect the overall situation. If any of you encounter such a situation, I have a suggestion. Let me tell you something. In a battle of life and death, whoever was more afraid of death would die faster. Our 3 Pure One secret techniques are unrivaled at the 5-ring level. No one can compare to us. Others can risk their lives, but we can't. I hope that all of you will be able to distinguish your gains and losses, be brave and fearless, and bring out the momentum of the 3 Pure Ones. When the time comes, I will also be able to claim credit for all of you in Longhuan Blessed Land. The next day, Tunghai was calm and tranquil. There were no clouds in the sky. It was another sunny day. Dozens of miles away from Tunghai, a transparent, circular space appeared on the surface of the sea. With a diameter of 10 miles, it was an empty space. There were no mountains, rivers, greenery, or trees. This was the official competition space of the 5-ring level. Because some cultivators were afraid that the environment would be beneficial to them, and some will be detrimental to them, there was nothing at all. It was like a small void. With a diameter of 10 miles, it was enough for both a spell cultivator and a swordsman. The spherical space was like a person's head. There were even 2 small space bubbles at the side of the ears. This was a place for the other cultivators to stay. It was to separate them from the spectators and prevent any unfairness from occurring. For example, Jean Dan's elders would give advice to their disciples. Here, everything depended on oneself. You could only rely on yourself. The fighting style was to defend the ring. The winner would stay, and the loser would leave. There were 3 ways to lose: death, admitting defeat, and the Jean Dan stage cultivators outside would admit defeat on behalf of their own disciples. Therefore, it was not a true death match. This was also a small scheme of the Kuan Dao. We, the Kuan Dao, are not afraid of death, but are you, the 3 Pure Ones? If you are not, then let's perish together. If you are, then admit defeat. The control of this space was controlled by a third-party cultivator. It was the Jean Dan of the Tai Heavenly Sect. All the influence on the cultivators in the space was done by him alone. Of course, this was done under the eyes of hundreds of spectators outside. Among them, there was no lack of experienced Jean Dan. It was harder than ascending to the heavens to tamper with it. Under the joint oath of the Jean Dan of the 3 Pure Ones and the Jean Dan of the Kuan Dao, Tai Jean Dan announced the establishment of the bet. The combatants from both sides entered the ears of the battle space and waited for the battle to begin. At this moment, a strange Jean Dan cultivator with a kind smile on his face came to the side of the Kuan Dao and the Weijian Mountain and gave them an important reminder. Be careful of the 2 heavy ears. The role of the 2 small spaces is not only to accommodate other cultivators, but also to disperse the mysterious power. In other words, if someone wants to perish together, I'm afraid he will be disappointed. Don't thank me. I'm just a kind-hearted passerby who can't stand some filthy things. The man turned and left, leaving Yi a little confused. However, the expression of the Jean Dan of the Kuan Dao changed slightly. Yi saw the change in the expression of the Jean Dan of the Kuan Dao and reacted instantly. Fellow cultivator, why do you, the Kuan Dao, have to do this? Do you not trust the Weijian Mountain? The Jean Dan of the Kuan Dao said tiredly, Sorry, we just want to do our part. After all, it's the trouble of the Kuan Dao, and it can make the Weijian Mountain more relaxed. But we didn't expect. Yi frowned, but he couldn't complain. After all, this was an ally who was using his own death to pave the way for the gamble. Such an ally was of course fine, but he would pay a meaningless death. Originally, they could have made better arrangements. In some unorthodox ways, the weakness of the swordsman's ability was undoubtedly exposed, and the overall strength of the Kuan Dao was not enough. So they fell into such a trap. Now that the oath had been made, how could they go back on it in front of so many people? There were some things that couldn't be explained. Things were getting more and more out of control. He knew the virtues of the swordsman of the Weijian Mountain. He had always considered himself as the protector of the Kuan Dao, plus some feelings of pity for the fairer sex. If he saw the female swordsman self-destruct in order to hurt the enemy, his heroic spirit would burst out. Unless he won, the last 3 swordsmen would not be able to survive. If the women could risk their lives, why couldn't the swordsman? The control of the coastal waters was lost without hurting the foundation, but they could find another opportunity to take it back. This was also something that could not be said. If this happened to the Weijian Mountain, would they think this way? They would definitely fight to the death. Who is the Jin Dan that delivered the message? Is he unfamiliar? I don't remember there being such a person in Arai. Jin Dan, who was in charge of this matter in the Kuan Dao realm, could be considered to have a wide range of friends, but he had no impression of this person at all. Inyi snorted disdainfully. He's not from our Arai, so of course you haven't seen him. I could smell his jealousy from afar. Who else in the 5 rings would dare to undermine the 3 pure ones behind their backs? Why didn't he say it earlier or later? He had to wait until the oath was made and the people were sent in. He obviously wants us to fight to the death, and then he can reap the benefits. Chapter 365. P.S. Brute, we're old acquaintances. Take it easy, you'll get killed. Lu Xiaoyi was in a small space. He felt that not only was his spiritual connection with the cultivators outside cut off, he couldn't even sense his other 8 companions. The mysteries of space were not something he could understand at the moment. He felt that his celestial powers were not affected at all. This was what he was most concerned about. If the celestial powers in this space were to be obstructed, there was no need to fight. He could just admit defeat. The space in front of him began to loosen. He knew that this was a sign that the first battle was about to begin. He squeezed his body forward, and under the guidance of the starlight, he passed through the center of the spherical space. He continued to move forward with the 4-season spear. In the next moment, the 4-season spear found its target. The cultivator opposite him was the indigenous cultivator of the 3 pure ones. He was also the weakest among the cultivators of the 3 pure ones. The reason he participated in this battle was not because of his strength, but because he was using his identity as a cultivator of the 3 pure ones. Even if his strength was average, he knew that the swordsmen liked to take the initiative. They were fast, and their flying sword were fast. It was almost certain that they would attack first. It was difficult for a spell cultivator to fight for the first strike. He didn't pursue this. In the small space, he put on 7 or 8 sets of defensive spells, talismans, magic weapons, spells, and even a spiritual pet. Once the space opened, he tried his best to fight forward. He knew that even if he couldn't win against the swordsman, he had to. The further he fought, the more room he had to maneuver. Otherwise, if he was pressed against the walls of the space, he wouldn't be able to fight. Before entering the arena space, Martial Uncle Jin Dan had already told him that his first battle was to put on a show to show the origin of the matter. He just had to admit defeat after a few rounds. It was to fight for a sense of existence, and he was a representative of the indigenous people's rights. But he had his own pride. How could he surrender without a fight, especially when the opponent was only a mid-stage cultivator? So his idea was to fight first. If he could fight, he would fight and try to win. If he admitted defeat after realizing that he was no match for the swordsman, there were still elders of the 3 pure ones outside. They would be able to see clearly if there was anything wrong with the swordsman. So it was very safe. It was a simple idea, but once he stepped out of the small space, he was hit in the head, because he realized that all his defenses were gone. This was another ancillary function of the small space. It was also for the sake of fairness. Only when a cultivator entered the large space to fight could they begin to buff themselves, set up defenses, and throw attacks. They didn't have to carry a turtle shell into the large space. He didn't know. He was not a spell cultivator who specialized in battle, so his experience in this area was limited. His mental fortitude was even more limited. His uncle master had never mentioned this to him. In a fluster, his body was still flying forward according to his previous thoughts. Then, he hurriedly set up a defense for himself. At this moment, he was locked on by the flying sword. It was only now that he discovered that he had rushed forward a bit too fiercely. Or it could be said that his opponent had rushed forward even more fiercely. In the blink of an eye, the distance between the two sides had closed to less than 3,000 feet. In the next moment, the Four Seasons arrived before him. He shouldn't have rushed. Realizing that he didn't have any defensive spells, he shouldn't have rushed. He should have moved along the walls of the space to add a few more layers of protection. Even if he admitted defeat, at least he would have time to shout. He only had time to cast 4 or 5 layers of defense, and the casting speed was still the fastest, but it was also the most unreliable. Under the sharp flying sword, it did not even have the effect of slowing down the enemy before it was pierced through in one strike. Piercing through his heart, Lu Xiaoyi stretched out his hand, intending to swing his sword and add another blow. However, he did not expect that this guy, who had rushed over aggressively, was completely useless upon contact. The sword chi that burst out when the flying sword pierced through directly blew a big hole in his heart. How could he add another blow? He didn't even touch his sword. Instead, he took out a stick of sugar-coated haws to knock him out. This guy really had a lot of blood. There was almost no process to this attack. It reduced the dazzling battles of the cultivation world to the point where it was boring. It was like a street thug running over and smashing a scholar who had just woken up with a brick. The crowd didn't quite react. They thought it was the beginning, but it was the end. They had just sat down on the bench and reached for the sunflower seeds. And it was already over. Return to your space. The next round will start from the small space again. Tai Jin Dan's expression didn't change. It was impossible to tell which side he was leaning towards. The nature of his space made it so that the two auxiliary functions didn't favor either side. Scattered gods were disadvantageous to a swordsman's indiscriminate destruction. However, they could only activate their offensive and defensive spells inside the space, which was very advantageous to a fast swordsman. This was because a swordsman relied on 2 things to fight: speed and flying swords. On the other hand, a spell cultivator was much more troublesome. A series of talismans, a series of magic tools and spiritual treasures, and a series of spells. Unless one could use them instantaneously, it was very difficult to use all of them in front of a fast swordsman. Of course, nothing was absolute. On one hand, Lu Xiaoyi's speed was too fast, and he didn't pause to switch to sword riding mode. On the other hand, this native cultivator was a little slow. His speed was slow, and his spell casting was even slower. Normally, it wouldn't be obvious, but in this critical moment, being slow was a sin. Lu Xiaoyi flew back while licking the sugar-coated haws. It wasn't that he had to act like this. It was that he had to borrow something to cover up his awkwardness of fainting at the sight of so many people. What was the best cover? It was the perverted and bloodthirsty, sugar-coated haws. He had to pull everyone's impression of him away from fainting at the sight of blood and change it into a psychopathic demon. Once people found out about his fainting at the sight of blood, they would have the best way to deal with him. One person would bait him with injuries, while the other would kill him, or even spit out blood himself, or use a similar blood Dao technique. The sugar-coated haws were just right. It could reduce the duration of fainting at the sight of blood, and it could also create the illusion of a pervert, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. The Kuan Dao side won the first round. Although the process was astonishingly fast, it didn't exceed the predictions of the people below. They were all non-elite cultivators from various sections. The 3 pure ones had other missions, while the Wei Sword Mountain swordsman was a middle-stage cultivator. The 2 of them were evenly matched, but it was obvious that the swordsman was better at fighting, so it wasn't surprising that the spell cultivator was defeated so easily. Only the 3 pure ones and the other 2 golden core stage cultivators were able to see this clearly. This was because they knew that the 5 layers of defense of this native cultivator were not as stable as a mountain, but it was enough for a middle stage foundation establishment stage sword cultivator. The swordsman's sword is very strong. The leader, Jean Dan, had a serious expression. Another Jean Dan comforted, "Senior brother, don't worry. The remaining 8 disciples won't make such a low-level mistake. As long as he can withstand the swordsman's first 3 strikes, he won't be able to hold on for long. However, that fellow Taoist from Tai is sitting on the fence. He didn't tell us all about the additional functions of this space." The leader, Jean Dan, had an ashen expression. He was the one who found Tai, and he had some friendship with him. It was obvious that he had been tricked. This Taoist Tai didn't side with either side from the start. He chose to sit on the fence between the 3 pure ones and the Xian Yuan. He had already agreed to the 3 pure ones' request. What more do you want? I can't tell you all about the secrets of this space, right? Chapter 366. P.S. Uncle, you're wrong. Why don't we go back and discuss this? You're in the league, and I'll add 2 more chapters for you. Lu Xiaoyi slowly returned to the small space, just as he finished eating the candied haws. He hoped that this problem of his would change after he reached a higher level. It was too out of place and was detrimental to his image. When he was in the Chi Eater stage, his blood faintness was very obvious. Now that he was in the Foundation Establishment stage, it was much better. He could use other methods to cover it up. He didn't know when he would be able to get rid of this awkwardness. The battle had just begun. He could guess that the second cultivator wouldn't be so simple, but he still wouldn't change his strategy. Once he started fighting, it meant that he couldn't continue. Because of his damned mana, because he didn't have much experience in swordsmanship. Fortunately, in the space, others couldn't sense the presence of the sword spirit on his sword. He didn't have to wait for long. The winner had limited time to return to the small space. Otherwise, it would be obvious that Jean Dan, who was in charge of the space, was biased. The principle was that the winner couldn't be given time to recover his mana. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a challenge, but a one-on-one duel with unlimited mana. Lu Xiaoyi became more and more familiar with this. Before the space fully opened, he rushed out while it was still half closed. He used the starlight escape technique several times and passed through the center of the circle. As usual, a flying sword flew out of the box. But this time, his opponent learned his lesson and didn't rush forward. He probably also felt that he couldn't beat the swordsman. Once he was out of the space, he moved along the walls of the space and began to put on defense. In the 3 pure ones internal practice, he was already able to attack and defend against cultivators ranked in the top 300. Although there was still a difference between practice and actual combat, the difference wasn't too big with his basic skills. His strategy was correct. He cast spells in an orderly manner. Having learned from the mistakes of his predecessors, he was not at all surprised by the empty state after exiting the space. Therefore, when Lu Xiaoyi entered the attack range, this Dharma cultivator of the 3 pure ones had just completed his full set of preparations. He saw the swordsman kill just now and knew that his opponent's first attack was very heavy. This was a non-standard fighting style that shifted the focus of the attack to the beginning of the battle. It was rare, but not rare for the swordsman. But this time, the other party sent 2 sword pellets flying over. Was it one heavy and one light? Or maybe one was lighter and one was heavier? He didn't believe that this middle-stage Foundation Establishment cultivator had the ability to send out 2 heavy swords in succession. In the cultivation world, you have to rely on basic common sense. He could not exaggerate the terror of his opponent. That would put him in an eternal and unnecessary fear. The fact that he was in the middle stage of Foundation Establishment meant that the time he had to practice the sword was limited. Mastering the first flying sword's penetrative power was already inconceivable, let alone mastering 2. That was a flying sword. It was a flying sword that required a sword formation to be inscribed on it. It was something that required endless time to nurture, practice, and improve. Take his own artifacts, for example. He could afford dozens of artifacts, but could he refine each artifact to the point of perfection? This was the basic law of the cultivation world, and no one could go against it. Therefore, he made two preparations. One hand formed a talisman to continue setting up the defensive array, while the other took out a magic artifact to prepare for a counterattack. He was someone who advocated offense and did not like to allow others to act recklessly and make him fall into a passive position. This was a very correct philosophy, but the prerequisite was that you had to be able to block your opponent's flying sword. Liu Xiaoyi had practiced the sword for 30 years, and all his achievements were in the sharpness of his sword. In terms of sword formation and cultivation, his flying sword was in the category of normal external swords, but he had additional bonuses. Sword spirit bonuses. 37. 7 Imbalance fulcrum. The addition of the star's sword force. These 3 bonuses caused his sword force to completely break away from the normal category, becoming incomprehensibly heavy, unimaginably heavy. Others could not see this kind of heaviness. Only those who had experienced it personally would know. Unfortunately, the first 3 Pure Ones cultivator had died too quickly and had no way to tell this secret to his companions. In an instant, the sword force was unstoppable. All the defenses were unable to withstand a single blow after surpassing its endurance. The cultivator felt that something was wrong. He quickly released a handful of talismans with his left hand and threw away the magic artifact with his right hand. He drew a long sword in an attempt to make a final struggle. It was useless. In the face of absolute power, any struggle was futile. The 4 seasons and Zhucheng entered one after another. It was not clear who came first, who came second, who came first, who came second. But one thing was certain: the 4 seasons had already broken through most of the barriers of the cultivator, and then Zhucheng arrived, another one-hit kill. There was no difference from the previous first place, but the spectators inside and outside the arena had a different feeling. Kuandao Jindan's face was filled with excitement. She realized that Kuandao might have really made a mistake, underestimating the strength of Weijian Mountain. Their plan to sacrifice themselves was completely meaningless. If the strength of the 5 swordsmen of Weijian Mountain was like this, what was the suspense of the battle? Senior Inyi, the swordsman of your sect, is very strong. I have never seen this young man before. Your Weijian Mountain has hidden him really well. Inyi smiled bitterly. It was indeed very well hidden, hidden on the dome of Wolf's Ridge. The leader of the Sword Union was indeed the leader. His move was indeed extraordinary. Although his cultivation level was not high, his sword skills had completely surpassed the normal level. He was a veteran who had immersed himself in external swords for hundreds of years. His understanding of external sword was not something that a cultivator could compare to. After 2 rounds, he had already confirmed that this small external sword from Xianyuan definitely had a secret on it. Sword spirit. It cannot be anything else. He doesn't like to see people. Yes, that person is shy. He could not continue speaking. He could not possibly say that the other 4 swordsmen might not have this kind of ability, right? Wouldn't that be destroying the prestige of Weijian Mountain? Weijian Mountain respected Xianyuan very much. But what they respected was the internal sword, not the external sword. This person was just an accident. It must be shy, perverted. Kuandao Jindan was speechless. There were countless perverts in the 5-ring continent. There were sword vain, dharma vain, and physique vain. There were all different types of perverts. Like this Fei Chai, he was one of the simpler types. He was bloodthirsty and did not dare to show it in public, so he could only use bright red sugar-coated haws to replace it. Yes, it must be like this. Han. Yin was speechless. She was originally happy that her sect had hope of winning the competition and that Boating Ting Island was safe. This was a great thing, but for some reason, she could not be happy. She felt that she was an accomplice because those disgusting sugar-coated haws were personally made by her. She had never thought that such simple sugar-coated haws would have such an effect in a certain environment. Everything was unpredictable. This Fei Chai, ever since she met him, Her impression of him had always wavered between good and bad. Every time he surprised her, she did not know what kind of person he was. But there was one thing: he was definitely not a loser. What did it have to do with her? No matter how strong he was, it was impossible for him to defeat all the cultivators of the three pure ones. She would eventually go on stage, eventually. Chapter 367. P.S. Uncle, I'm done for. I'll return the money you gave me back later, as long as you give me enough. The cultivators of the three pure ones sacrificed 2 lives and finally figured out the ins and outs of this sword cultivator. Although the battle was short, some things were still traceable. The first cultivator only activated half of his defense before the swordsman charged at him. Hence, he was killed instantly. This was the difference in strength. Speed, reaction, and response were all problems. It was a normal outcome. The second cultivator's response was standard. He didn't charge at the enemy, but activated his defense first. The other cultivators saw clearly that he activated a total of 7 layers of defense with different attributes. There were talismans, magical items, spells, and physical skills. This was the standard operation of the three pure ones. However, he was still pierced through. This meant that the strength of the Feichai sword was far beyond normal. The reason was unknown. It could be a problem with a flying sword, or it could be due to its potential or some other mysterious force. For example, momentum. Regarding the defense of cultivators, there was their own judgment in the world of cultivation. Generally speaking, a successful defense didn't mean that you had to use all your strength and turn yourself into a turtle shell. In a cultivator's battle philosophy, they would first judge the strength of the opponent's attack, and then, based on this foundation, they would put in some surplus to ensure a safe defensive effect. The purpose of doing this was to leave some mana margin for a counterattack, and not to shrink into a ball and be completely passive. No matter what sect the cultivator was from, a balance between offense and defense was a concept. A pure attack might succeed, but a pure defense would definitely result in a passive situation. It was impossible to not counterattack. No cultivator who didn't know how to fight would do this. Take the strength of the flying sword as an example. The three pure ones, Xian Yuan and Weijin Mountain, had been in contact with the external sword for tens of thousands of years. They knew their limits. This wasn't a secret and couldn't be hidden. It was just like how the three pure ones couldn't hide their spells from the swordsman. Assuming that the attack power of the external sword was 10,000 Jin, according to the experience of the magic cultivators, as long as he increased his defense by 50%, reaching a defense power of 25,000 Jin, there wouldn't be any problems. There wouldn't be any accidents. The remaining magic power reserves would be used for a possible counterattack at any time. In determining whether or not a foundation establishment cultivator was an expert, perfect judgment was very important. If a cultivator could use a defense of 10,000 Jin when the opponent's attack was 10,000 Jin, then it would be a perfect defense. It meant that you didn't have to use any more magic power, which also meant that you could use more magic power to counterattack. Of course, if you made a wrong judgment and your defense was broken, then you would reap what you sow and become a joke. It was not easy to be an expert. Accurate judgment, bold and meticulous, and rich experience were not things that everyone could achieve. In view of the first cultivator's defeat, the second cultivator had deliberately added 50% more power to the swordsman's standard flying sword. Yet he was still pierced through. This could only mean that the power of this swordsman's flying sword was not to be underestimated. It had already exceeded the limits of normal judgment. This was the most frightening thing. How much did it exceed the standard by? How many methods did this swordsman know to increase the power of his flying sword? This was the most troublesome thing to think about. This was because he could no longer be understood using normal logic. So, how much should his defense be to be considered safe? At the very least, he had to endure the first attack of his flying sword. If his estimation was too low, he would be in danger. If his estimation was too high, not only would it be a waste of energy, he would also lose the ability to counterattack. How could he hope to win if he was constantly being beaten up? There was also a very important problem. Would the swordsman's second flying sword be as heavy? This was the problem that Lu Xiaoyi created for his opponent. How would you withstand my first attack? This was a problem that every remaining cultivator of the three pure ones had to face, especially the third cultivator who was about to go on stage. The host Jean Dan would not give him much time to recover. This was originally a factor that would benefit the three pure ones. But now, he was hoping for more time so that he could think more clearly and thoroughly. If he thought this way, it meant that there was a gap in his Dao heart. It meant that he was mentally unbalanced under the consecutive attacks. This meant that even before the battle began, he was already showing signs of defeat. How would he move after he went out? Left or right? Up or down? The space had already been opened. His opponent was as fast as ever, but he was still thinking about how to defend himself. How to coordinate, which was the first and which was the last to achieve the best results. His opponent had already passed the center point. He was even more hesitant. Would the barrier be effective? Would using a secret technique to leave in an instant bring trouble to himself? When his opponent was only 3,000 to 4,000 feet away from his starting point, he suddenly realized that it was useless to think about anything. There was no need to think about how to defend himself. Once he went out, he would have to take the sword. Now, it was no longer a question of what to do after going out. It was a question of whether or not to go out. His mentality collapsed. The leader of the three pure ones, Jean Dan, let out a long sigh. With his consciousness, Tai Jean Dan, who was in charge of the space, immediately closed the crack in front of the three pure ones cultivator and announced the result. The three pure ones had lost. Senior, you. Another Jean Dan was a little unwilling to accept this. The leader, Jean Dan, let out a long sigh. I was wrong. The sect was wrong too. An eagle won't come out of seclusion in the sect. No matter how good their deduction methods are, when faced with life and death, they are still trash. Keeping a low profile is a paradox. When I go back, I will advise the sect to chase out all those who keep a low profile and stand aloof from worldly affairs. If you want to keep a low profile, you can change your name. But you must go out and experience the storm. Otherwise, you will be like this one, not even having the courage to stand out. Would the disciples on the ranking be like this? They would have gambled it out long ago. Jean Dan beside him comforted him. Senior, don't worry. This is just an isolated phenomenon. The ones behind shouldn't be like this. They actually have real battle experience, and I thought that we had to investigate this Fei Chai thoroughly. I've never heard of him before. He couldn't have jumped out from a crack in a rock, right? His killing methods are extremely skillful. He must have been around for a long time. Could it be that he used a fake name? On the side of the Kuan path, whether it was Jean Dan or the disciples below, they were all cheering. They had been defeated. Could they imagine before the battle? The dignified three pure ones, the pillars of the Dharma cultivators, had been forced to the point where they did not dare to step out of space. Who would believe it if they said it out loud? But it had really happened in front of their eyes. It was so real that it made them feel like they were dreaming. The Jean Dan from the Kuan Pass boundary had already completely relaxed. This battle was in the bag. With this Fei Chai's strength, winning one or two more battles was not a problem. He had defeated more than half of the three pure ones with his strength alone. Even if their Kuan Path's death warriors could not stop him, there were still 4 Weijian mountain swordsmen. With victory in sight, their mood was good. One of the Kuan Paths, Jean Dan laughed. Senior, this Fei Chai of yours is interesting. He likes to eat candied haws so much. When he returns, I will provide for him for a lifetime. But I find it strange. A disciple like this from Weijian Mountain should be famous. Another Kuan Paths, Jean Dan, suddenly remembered something. She had always been in charge of nurturing foundation establishment cultivators, so she had a better understanding of the level of foundation establishment, including the ranking. I suddenly remembered. In the last 5-ring foundation establishment ranking, there was once such a person. His name was Strange, and his ranking was also strange. He was also a Xianyuan external sword. He was ranked 999th, and his nickname was Candied Haws. Senior? Chapter 368. Inyu was a little embarrassed and coughed dryly. Ha! We have to keep this a secret for now. Among the 5 swordsmen that came from Weijin Mountain, there is indeed a Xianyuan external sword. You guessed right, it's this kid. He is the Candied Ha. The Candied Ha is him. The Fujin Dan wanted to laugh. It was not strange for Xianyuan to intervene. In fact, among the 5 rings, the one with the deepest relationship with the Xianyuan sword sect was not Weijin Mountain, but Xianyuan sword sect, because the one who established this relationship was the greatest person in the history of Xianyuan. That was Xuanyuan's god. Every time the Xianyuan sword sect was in danger, there was always Xuanyuan's faint support behind them. There was never a lack of support. One of the Jin Dans suddenly thought of something. Shi Xiang, Fei Chai's habit and name are so strange. If we can all guess it, the 3 pure ones would not have thought of it. What if they say that we pulled in foreign cultivators and do not accept the result this time? Inyi smiled proudly. Don't worry. I thought it long ago. There are many cultivators with 2 sects in the 5 rings. Is it rare? Xuanyuan's external sword is an external sword. Weijin Mountain's external sword is also an external sword. The orthodoxy is the same. Isn't it normal for the East to learn a few moves and the West to steal a few? We have already held an initiation ceremony for him. Therefore, the Candied Ha belongs to our Weijin Mountain. It's just that we used Xuanyuan's identity to mingle in the Western regions a few years ago. We can check the sect records and have the Weijin Mountain Sword Talisman as proof. Who dares to say that we broke the rules? Several Kuan Dao gold cores could not help but admire the shamelessness of Wei Jianshan. No wonder they only sent 5 sword cultivators. It turned out that they were confident. They did not know that there was indeed an initiation ceremony. However, Weijin Mountain did not know that the Xianyuan external sword they sent this time was so amazing. Ying had already started to make plans in private. This time, he had obtained a talent. He couldn't just foolishly give him back to Xianyuan. In any case, they had many powerful people. With the sharpness of the inner sword and the subjugation of the 5th ring, they wouldn't lack an outer sword, right? How could he think of a way to make Xianyuan fire this brat? The pressure soon fell on the 4th cultivator of the 3 pure ones. His name was Kai Wei. He might not be the strongest among the 9 participants of the 3 pure ones, but he was the most courageous. He didn't care. From his point of view, the swordsman's threat had been magnified. The reason why he had been able to suppress the swordsman until now was probably because he had never been attacked before. What would happen if a swordsman was attacked? Could he still maintain such a heavy sword pressure? How long could he maintain his combat prowess? He had always believed that to measure a cultivator's combat strength, one had to consider both offense and defense, and not just one aspect. This required him to risk his life. Because in this kind of arena space, the use of scapegoat tools was restricted. In the tens of thousands of years of development of the 5th ring, there had been countless similar battles. The funniest one was when a cultivator used 10 or so scapegoat talismans to exhaust his opponent to death. This made the battle even more of a farce. Since then, a trend had arisen in the cultivation world of the 5th ring. They began to reject the use of scapegoat tools that required extremely precious resources, especially in battles. Of course, the storage rings of the disciples of the large sects might contain a few scapegoat talismans. They were used to protect their lives in the wilderness. As soon as the space opened, Kai Wei rushed out without hesitation. He was not in a hurry to set up a defensive barrier. Instead, he took out 3 offensive magic tools: the soul-absorbing golden bell, the headless silver scissors, and the emerald mountain. These were the magic tools he was most proficient in and had refined to the fullest extent. He knew that now was not the time to hide his trump cards. The swordsman's attacks were sharp. If he didn't hide his trump cards now, he would lose his life. He wanted to see how his opponent would react in the face of a mutual explosion. Even if he died in battle, he would still be able to provide an idea for his fellow disciples to fight. His fearlessness made the spectating cultivators gasp in admiration. After all, the 3 pure ones were one of the top sections. While there might be cowards in the sect, there were also many brave people who took responsibility. The three magic tools were all carefully selected by him. They all had a common characteristic. They could attack from a great distance. Their control range was around 3,000 feet. A cultivator's techniques were limited by distance. This was the case for Foundation Establishment, Jindan, and above that, Yuanying and Perfected Monarchs. This would change according to the cultivator's divine sense. In battle, it was a contest of distance control. In this aspect, the swordsman's flying sword was no different from a spell cultivator's magic tool, because they both had the strength of a Foundation Establishment cultivator's divine sense. There was no need to talk about who would be at a disadvantage in terms of distance. It was a contest of mental strength. Kai Wei's spiritual power was considered strong, and this was also the reason why he dared to take the initiative to attack. The strategy he adopted was to keep the three offensive magic tools far away from him, keeping them 200 feet in front of him. The advantage of this was that as long as his opponent attacked with his sword, he would be able to reach him first. This was a helpless choice, because in terms of flying speed, magic tools were indeed inferior to flying swords. Hence, he could only attack earlier. It was also because of this that controlling three powerful magic tools at a distance of 200 feet was an enormous burden on a cultivator's magic power and soul. He was also very scoundrel. He still did not use a single defensive technique, and only focused all of his attention on attacking. He was staking everything on this one throw. There was no lack of courageous cultivators among spell cultivators. Lu Xiaoyi had already noticed this cultivator's movements. His mental strength was stronger than Kai Wei's. He had many ways to deal with this kind of desperate method. However, if he had to find the simplest, most direct, and most shocking method, there was only one. In this round of consecutive victories, he had begun to grasp a hint of the power of intimidation. In the third round, he had directly defeated his opponent. However, to be clearer, he had to be as quick as always. Only then would he be able to experience the true essence of intimidation to the greatest extent. With such an opportunity, why not use it? When the two sides were about 3,000 feet apart, the Four Seasons sword shot out, fully displaying the advantage of speed. At the same time, Kai Wei saw the opportunity. Without changing his mind, the three magic tools increased in power and smashed down. His judgment was very clear. No matter how fast your flying sword is, it has a distance of 3,000 feet. No matter how slow my magic tool is, it has a distance of 1,000 feet. No matter what, I will not fall behind. I want to see how you deal with my magic tools. This was the most exciting moment. It wasn't easy for the two sides to attack each other until now. However, what surprised everyone was that the swordsman who had been charging forward bravely, was actually retreating. Under the pull of the starlight, Lu Xiaoyi's forward charge abruptly turned into a retreat, making it impossible for the three celestial instruments to reach him. This kind of response was incomparably surprising, because if he did this, how could his flying sword achieve anything? Shouldn't you be fighting in close quarters? Now that neither side could hit the other, it looked like a draw on the surface. However, in terms of momentum, the swordsman's momentum was not there. He had lost his drive. Just as Kai Wei had expected, because the distance was too far, the flying sword had lost its last bit of precise control and swept past him a few dozen feet away. This was the worst-case scenario for a sword cultivator. The flying sword had rushed past its head and lost control. Chapter 369. Losing control of the flying sword usually meant that the flying sword was damaged, or too far away to be recalled. Looking at the current situation, it was obvious that the flying sword had lost its distance. The reason was simple. The cultivator's relentless attack forced the swordsman to retreat, causing him to forget to control his flying sword that was already flying too fast. At that moment, everyone seemed to have seen the swordsman's fatal weakness. Oh, so other than the heavy weight of his fur sword, he was actually just an inexperienced mid-stage swordsman? In the next moment, the swordsman disappeared. When he reappeared, he was only 10 feet away from Kai Wei. The sword in his hand was like the scythe of the Grim Reaper, heaven-measuring sword ruler. In the intense earlier stages of the competition, in the first 3 rounds, everyone had forgotten that the swordsman had a habit of using close-range combat. His inner sword had the shadow sword, while his outer sword had the heaven-measuring sword ruler. Especially when his flying sword had already flown past his opponent, it was theoretically possible for him to close in on his opponent in an instant. If that was the case, all of this could be the swordsman's sudden inspiration, but it could also be a deliberate death trap. The moment the swordsman closed in on him, Jean Dan of the 3 Pure Ones did not hesitate to send a message to Tai Jean Dan. Lu Xiaoyi's sword strike missed its target. His opponent had been moved to another place by some mysterious force. He licked his lips. Damn, it's been 2 rounds since he last ate Tong Halu. This disgusting action sent chills down the spines of the spectators. This person was really perverted. There was no blood, no killing, just look at his unsatisfied face. Actually, Lu Xiaoyi did not have to get close to his opponent. His flying sword was controlled by the sword spirit. In terms of range, it was an unbeatable killer. However, considering that there were still 5 cultivators of the 3 Pure Ones behind him, he had to keep some tricks up his sleeve. That was why he chose to get close to his opponent. It was a perfect response. Who asked his opponent to place his magic weapon so far away? If he didn't get close to him, who would? Just as the climax was about to arrive, it was doused with cold water. Who would be willing to do that? The audience booed loudly. However, Jean Dan of the 3 Pure Ones was extremely thick-skinned and acted as if he had not heard anything. Cultivators like Kai Wei were exactly what the 3 Pure Ones lacked. Of course, they had to save him. It was much more valuable than saving the 3rd cultivator. He had already shown his courage, and the only thing left to do was to fight with the swordsman within a few dozen feet. He would definitely be chopped into pieces. The cultivators outside all had different moods. But the 2 sides that remained inside the space could be said to be half ice water and half fire. On the side of Kuindao and Weijian Mountain, the 4 Kuindao cultivators were still fine. They could already faintly see victory and hope for survival. Therefore, there was joy in the silence, and a trace of nervousness in the longing. But in the ears of the host, Tai Jean Dan, it was filled with unbearable curses. They were all from the other 4 swordsmen of Weijian Mountain. Donkey Ball Fei Chai. Everyone sweeps the snow in front of their own door. You've already cleaned your own house, so why bother sweeping the widow's house next door? To your ancestors. Even if you want to eat alone, you can't eat it all in one go, right? At least leave 2 for the grandpas. Idiot. I even treated you to meat and wine. And this is how you repay me? A foundation establishment cultivator came to the front of several Jean Dan and reported in a low voice. The matter is clear. This Fei Chai is not the real Fei Chai. It's Sword Smoke Stub Lu Xiaoyi outside of Xianyuan. His nickname is Sugar-Coated Haws. This is the person who sneaked into Weijian Mountain's team to cause trouble here. He was once in the last 5-ring ranking and was ranked 999th. But for some reason, he wasn't selected this time. But I heard from friends who are familiar with the situation in the western regions that this person appeared 2 years ago in Jialan's 100 vine barges. He killed those elites and almost killed a few people. The few Golden Core cultivators shook their heads as they listened. This person was really trash. Listen to his name. In Xianyuan, he was called Cigarette Stub. In Weijian Mountain, he was called Sugar-Coated Haws. None of them were normal. The leader of the Jean Dan made a prompt decision. Stop the battle. Another Jean Dan hesitated. If we stop, no matter the reason, the 3 Pure Ones will be judged to have lost this time. The leader of the Jean Dan insisted. The outcome has already been decided. Junior brothers, are you still holding on to unrealistic fantasies? The 3 Pure Ones have been passed down for so long, and the biggest advantage is that we will retreat when we need to. We will never stubbornly hold on for the sake of face. This person is strong among the foundation establishment cultivators. Without looking at his cultivation, he is ranked in the top 10. Up to now, he hasn't shown any real ability. Our disciples have secret techniques. Does he not have any? In 4 battles, this person has consumed very little energy. Conservatively speaking, he can win at least 2 more battles. At that time, how many of us will be left? Is there anyone among our disciples who can turn the situation around? Not to mention, if this person really defeats our 3 pure ones, we will lose a lot of face. Why don't we make use of the fact that he is a disciple of Xianyuan and publicly announce that Weijian Mountain is cheating? Not only can we avoid casualties, but we can also dilute the outcome. We can also make another bet with Kuan Dao afterward. Why not? As expected of the Jin Dan realm, he had thought through the reasons. The other 2 Jin Dan of the 3 pure ones agreed. After making the decision, they immediately passed the message to Daoist Tai, who was in charge of the space. Lu Xiaoyi felt the space loosening and knew that the 5th battle had begun. He was squeezing forward, but he didn't expect the space to suddenly close. His face was almost flattened. The next moment, the restrictions around him disappeared. The blue sky above his head and the green water below his feet. Besides a few female Kuan Dao cultivators who were crying tears of joy, there were also 4 pairs of fierce eyes staring at him and slowly gathering towards him. Lu Xiaoyi was a little confused. This is the halftime break. It's time to eat? Those 3 pure ones cultivators who were unwilling to accept this also cast their gazes over. It was unforgettable. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. How could this be? Just like Wu Shang, he was like this in Wolf's Ridge. Perhaps it was also the tradition of the Dharma lineage, killing with one's eyes. He was a little regretful. Because he had lost his opponent, he had no chance to break through his domineering aura. The 3 pure ones reacted quickly and correctly. If he didn't consider his reputation, this was the best choice of the moment. He really wanted to clear all 9 of them. This battle space was very advantageous to him, including the rules. If it wasn't here, his battle would be much more difficult. Whether it was the hostility of the 3 pure ones cultivators, the admiration of the swordsmen of Weijian Mountain, or the gratitude in the eyes of the Kuan Dao cultivators, at least from now on, Lu Xiaoyi's name would gradually rise in the 5-ring continent. There would no longer be any reason to bury him, and no one would look down on him. At least in the circle of Foundation establishment, he had successfully turned from a small pawn into a big devil. And this was not what he wanted. At least, he felt that it was still too early. Chapter 370. The 3 pure ones, Kuan Dao realm, and Weijian Mountain's Jin Dan gathered together and quarreled fiercely. Beside them was a group of mediators led by Tai. In the quarrel, Yi proudly took out the evidence that he had prepared long ago. The 3 pure ones would definitely suffer this loss. The spectators who came from afar to watch the battle were also dissatisfied. They thought that would be a sumptuous meal, but in the end, it turned out to be a roadside snack. The worst thing was that a group of urban management officers rushed out halfway through the meal. It was really not satisfying. They would not complain about the 3 pure ones, nor would they complain about Kuan Dao and Xianyuan. They would not let go of Weijian Mountain, saying that there was a problem with their arrangement and that they had reversed the vanguard and the champion. There was a lot of noise. Some were happy, some were worried, and some were not afraid of making things worse. The 3 pure ones rejected Kuan Dao Li Realm's invitation to stay and left Fangting Island on the same day. No matter how thick-skinned they were, it was still human skin, and there was always a limit. Weijian Mountain did not leave, so there was no need to be in such a hurry. The key was that Yi still wanted to use Kuan Dao Li Realm to make Xianyuan look bad and poach him. He did not have much time, so he had to get it done before Xianyuan understood. Otherwise, once the news here spread, the corner would become cast iron, and it would be useless no matter how hard he tried. For this battle, although Xianyuan was far away, he was also involved. He sent Lu Xiaoyi to announce his attitude. Of course, Xianyuan did not expect that the swordsmen he sent would have such strength. Otherwise, they would have told Weijian Mountain to strengthen the control and protection. Yi knew this reason, which was why he had this idea. He had a very high position in the Weijian Mountain Gold Corps. Otherwise, he would not have been sent here alone. He had a certain amount of authority to make decisions. Moreover, he was even more clear that if this matter was reported, the sect would definitely support it. They could only use their power from behind and would definitely not stop it. Senior brother, why are you in such a hurry? It's just a letter of safety, that's all. But that's right. We still have to thank Xian Yuan for helping us by sending such an outstanding disciple. So, I'll write a letter of praise and send it over by secret transmission. Jin Dan, the leader of the swordsman sect, whose name was Yu Ping, said with a smile. However, he did not know that this seemingly upright senior brother swordsman was actually full of evil tricks. Yi laughed dryly. No need, no need. I've already written the letter. All you need to do is leave a seal, engrave a certificate, and use your teleportation channel. He thought about it carefully. He couldn't do it himself. Xian Yuan would guard against him. But Xian Yuan would not guard against the Koan Dao Li realm. Yu Ping stretched out her hand. The sun has really risen from the west. Even someone like senior apprentice brother would be so meticulous. Fine, give it to me. I'll upload it to senior apprentice brother. Yi put on an amiable smile. No need to trouble junior marshal sister. Junior marshal sister only needs to lead me there, and I will pass it myself. Yu Ping also smiled amiably. Senior apprentice brother, your skill of deceiving people is too bad, isn't it? We've known each other for hundreds of years. Do you think I don't know you? Give me the letter. I like to see what's written on it. If there's someone who smears my Koan Dao, I won't forgive you. Yu was helpless. He was under the eaves, so he had to lower his head. In other people's territory, it was impossible for him to send a letter with an unknown purpose. So he could only hand it over and apologize. Junior marshal sister, look at the situation in Arai. There's a lot of pressure. Therefore, the competition for disciples is fierce. Since we are all from Arai, why don't you just turn a blind eye to it? Xian Yuan is a rich man. He has a lot of money, so he doesn't care about these trivial things. With a sweep of his divine sense, Yi's nonsense was clear. The first part was nonsense, so he did not mention it. This battle was an example of joint interaction under the covenant. It fully demonstrated the friendly spirit of understanding, tolerance, and mutual assistance. The cultivators of the three sects cooperated sincerely, and each had their own performance. They learned from each other's strengths to make up for their weaknesses. This was a victory of cooperation, a victory of unity. Every sect and every person played an irreplaceable role in it. However, there are also imperfections under the jewel. After the sun, there were shadows. In some aspects, this battle also showed the lack of morals of some cultivators. For example, Lan Chong of Weijin Mountain and Xuanyuan Cigarette, but they did not care about cooperation, were unwilling to share, and were greedy for credit. There were even some who were disharmonious and bullied the weak. They thought that they had contributed to Ding Hai, so they flirted with Kuan cultivators, spouted nonsense, and had bad intentions. Lan Chong flirted with Xiao Jian first and Cigarette, but was the last. It was very shameful and damaged the reputation of Swordvane. It was also detrimental to the unity of the alliance. In view of this, Weijin Mountain has opened Lan Chong for 3 years to serve as a warning to others and observe the consequences. This notice is not for punishment, but for the truth and mutual trust. Here, we shall be friends forever, forever and ever. Yu Ping was amused and exasperated at the same time. Senior brother Yi, who looked righteous and selfless, was really a mess. He was shrouded in fog and did not tell the truth. He was full of lies, but when you thought about it, it did not seem to be completely groundless. Cigarette, but was Fei Chai. He took on 4 cultivators alone and forced the 3 pure ones to retreat. However, he said that he did not know how to cooperate and take all the credit for himself. It did not seem to be a complete lie. Lan Chong to Xiao Jian and Cigarette, but to Han Yin were just Kuan Dao Li Jia was afraid that they would be unfamiliar with Fong Ting. They sent cultivators to receive them to interact and get to know each other in the future. Did they have bad intentions? The funniest thing was that in order to make it look real, Yi even dragged in the innocent Lan Chong and accused him of something he didn't do. His real intention was, "You see, Wei Jianshan, am impartial. As a big brother, shouldn't you set an example? The most detailed thing was the severity of the punishment. It was not a serious crime like killing one's master. Of course, Xianyuan would not expel a swordsman from the sect forever. Therefore, Weijin Mountain decided to expel him for 3 years to observe the consequences. What a clever move. If Xianyuan did not check, he would also expel him for 3 years. He would probably lose this cultivator immediately and would not have the chance to observe the consequences. Inyi knew that these little tricks could not fool the observant people. He smiled apologetically, which was rare. Sister Yuping, we've known each other for hundreds of years. I've never asked you for anything, have I? This is the first time. You can't disappoint your brother. Yuping was speechless. This guy was already so old, but he still dared to say brother and sister. How shameless. Senior martial brother, to achieve your goal, you dragged the innocent Lan Chong into this. Doesn't it hurt you to do this? Inyi chuckled. He's my disciple. If he dares to fart, I'll slap him. Yuping dared not promise him. It was impossible. She was about to reject him when her martial uncle's voice rang in her ears. Let him be. For thousands of years, Weijian Mountain has never taken advantage of Xianyuan. It's the same this time. Yuping sighed and pretended to be troubled. All right, we're close. But this won't happen again. Chapter 371. Lu Xiaoyi was treated like a hero on Boating Ting Island, which made him feel uncomfortable all over. He knew the importance of double standards. When others treated him like a hero, he was not far from death. Therefore, the only thing that could help him was to defile himself. How could he defile himself in a place like Boating Ting Island, which was full of women? It definitely wasn't a fight. His behavior automatically began to move in the direction that Taoist Inyi had described. It was also hard to predict the fate of the underworld. Go ahead and shout. Even if you shout to the heavens, no one will come to save you. A pretty maid was forced into a corner by him, trembling. Lu Xiaoyi grinned and stretched out his evil hand. A sigh came from behind him. Fei Chai, I really want to know, if I didn't stop you this time, would you really have done it? Lu Xiaoyi didn't even turn his head and continued to press. You can try. If you pity her so much, why don't you take her place? Han Yan's figure flashed, and she threw the maid out of the room. She stood in front of Lu Xiaoyi, standing there with her breasts slightly puffed out and her eyes clear. I definitely won't resist. I'm just waiting for you to show your evil side. I want to see to what extent you can pretend. Lu Xiaoyi continued to stretch out his hand until his fingers were about to touch Han Yan's sensitive area. Finally, he stopped and complained, Han Yan, what are you doing here? Every time I'm about to succeed, I meet you. In any case, our relationship is not bad. Don't force me. Han Yan laughed. If you really want to do something bad, it won't be like this. At least I can feel that when you do something bad, you always choose a time when others will come in and see you. Moreover, you've never succeeded. With your ability to defeat 4 cultivators of the 3 pure ones in a row, how can you be so stupid in other directions? Why are you doing this? Lu Xiaoyi had no choice but to give up. Call me Xiaoyi. What cigarette but Fei Chai Tongalu, it's too unpleasant to hear. Han Yan smiled and sat down beside him. She had her own unique ability to distinguish a person's true intentions. Therefore, his facade was simply unable to deceive her. In fact, it was not only her. There were many other sisters who also had a woman's talent in this aspect. They were able to see through his little trick with a single glance. He was still too inexperienced to pretend to be a bad guy. Why should it be like this? Everyone is envious of you. I'm envious of your excellent swordsmanship, young hero, but you don't seem too happy? Lu Xiaoyi sighed. You don't know. This kind of envy was the poison behind it. Everyone had their own troubles. When they were weak, they had their own troubles. When their strength rose, they had their own troubles. There was no end to it. Everyone is praising me. Your Kuan Daoli realm, those bastards from Wei Sword Mountain, and even your opponent, the 3 pure ones. They even spread rumors that I have the ability to enter the top 10 of 5-ring foundation establishment cultivators. This was overpraising. After this battle, those who challenge me in the future will no longer be nobodies, but the true experts at the forefront. He would stop at nothing and no longer care about the rules. The key point is that I still don't have the ability to ignore others. You let a wolf mingle with a group of tigers. Isn't this just making things difficult for others? Hanyan finally understood a little. Her strength was far from reaching Lu Xiaoyi's level, so she was unable to imagine his troubles. Every family had their own problems. But what does this have to do with you always finding opportunities to defame yourself? Is there any necessary connection between strength and character? If you were a powerhouse with a bad record, wouldn't others find more reasons to attack you? Since Lu Xiaoyi had said this, he did not want to hide it. He had a special feeling towards this Hanyan. That kind of pure and untainted impression was not only on the outside, but also on the inside. This was a very special feeling, like two special souls, a special recognition between each other. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. At this point, what happens outside is already out of control. What I want to control is the trouble within the sect. The stronger you are, the greater the responsibility. Simply speaking, there will be endless missions to find you, making you unable to rest for even a moment, whether you are willing or not. The trouble outside can be avoided, but the trouble from the sect cannot be avoided. Just like this time when I came to Fangding Island, frankly speaking, I did not want to come. Hanyan finally understood, in this young swordsman's heart, he had not truly accepted becoming a true swordsman, a ruthless swordsman who would always use the harshest training to temper himself, always use the most difficult missions to temper himself, just like those lunatics in Weijin Mountain. This was not strange. Not every swordsman had a sword heart, and not every Taoist had a Tao heart. Just like herself, what Tao heart did she have? The heart needed to be tempered. Realm, knowledge, experience, changes, setbacks, blows, and even death. Every cultivator would fumble their way forward on this path, but how many of them would dare to say that they had a heart for cultivation? At the very least, this young swordsman had the means of a swordsman even before he had a true sword heart. She did not know how he managed to cultivate it. Just from his point alone, he was stronger than the majority of cultivators in the same realm. A wave of sympathy welled up in Han Yan's heart. This was a cultivator whose strength far surpassed his mentality. In the understanding of cultivators, this kind of disharmony could easily lead to chi deviation. If he deviated from the normal path, then, little e, can you tell me why you eat sugar-coated haws after killing people? This habit is not good. Others will see you as a pervert. Is there a reason? Or is it just a habit? Do you like blood? Do you like red? Lu Xiaoyi was very embarrassed. To tell the truth, he did not want to explain this matter to others. They did not believe him, including his closest friends, Yin Bo, Yin Heng. But under the clear eyes of this woman in front of him, he did not want to lie. At the same time, he warned himself that this was the last time he would reveal the truth to others. I faint from blood. They don't believe it. I've fainted since I was young. After I started cultivating, it got better, but it was not completely eradicated. Eating sugar-coated haws can help me recover quickly. You know, in frequent battles, even a moment of absent-mindedness can bring danger to my life. I don't want others to find out my secret, so Han Yan's smile was like a spring flower. She could feel that Lu Xiaoyi was speaking the truth. She was very happy that he was willing to tell her his biggest secret. She would also keep this secret forever. But this secret was still so laughable. It made this sword cultivator who killed people without batting an eyelid in the eyes of outsiders become so real, so cute, making people feel pity for him. She took Lu Xiaoyi's hand and walked into the room. Little e, blood is not scary. Some blood represents slaughter, so you don't want to look at it directly. But some blood represents a new life. For example, every child's mother's blood when they first come to this world. I can't make you understand this kind of lifeblood, but I can show you another kind of blood, a kind of blood when a young girl becomes a woman. When you understand its meaning, you will know that it is only a very simple psychological barrier. Chapter 372. P.S. Gathering Together. bullying an old man, using bean buns instead of rations. At the top of the dome, in a side hall of the Sword Aura Court, more than 10 Jin Dan sat together. They were holding a monthly meeting of the Xianyuan External Sword, which was hosted by a few Jin Dan members of the Sword Aura Court. The participants came from all the peaks and halls of the External Sword, such as the Arrival Hall, the External Hall, the Dark Hall, the Ming Hall, the Boa Tower, the Sword Enshrining Tower, the Equipment Sect Tower, the Pill House, etc. Lu Xiaoyi knew a few familiar faces: Gu Gang, Gu Shan, Gu Lin. This was a habit of the External Sword, and it had been so for tens of thousands of years. After all, they had to manage 20,000 Foundation establishment cultivators, and there was a lot of work to be done. They had to coordinate the distribution of resources and the distribution of rewards, and they had to be fair and just. They had to coordinate the assignment of tasks, and they could not be too biased. They had to plan the cultivation of disciples, the lectures for the assembly, and so on. They also had to communicate the internal harmony of the entire external sword system and limit the differences and conflicts within a reasonable range. Therefore, the monthly Jin Dan meeting was very important. Everyone would make judgments and decisions on important matters, including the punishment of disciples. Punishment, like rewards, was an important method that could not be ignored. Xianyuan did not have many punishments, and most of them were grounding or completing difficult tasks. However, there were many who were expelled, and there were at least 8 or 10 of them every year. There were many reasons, and there were always bad habits that were hard to change. Most of them were due to accidental injuries in battle, which caused irreversible mistakes. For example, this time, a Jin Dan member of the Sword Aura Court frowned. Cigarette, but who knows this person? What's the situation? Why did the message that Kuan Dao sent us have such a bad impression of this person? Greedy for merit? This is pardonable. Disunity? This is a big problem. Regardless of whether it is Wei Sword Mountain or Kuan Dao Li Jie, they are Xuanyuan's most important allies in the Fifth Ring. Every swordsman has been reminded countless times to cooperate with each other and never put on the airs of a top sect. This is a problem of attitude. Harassing a Kuan Dao female cultivator? Improper? This, who knows if it is improper or not? Is it intention, or is it real? The other disciple, Jin Dan, had an extremely displeased expression on his face. His name was Gu Dong, and just like his name, he was an upright person who did things in an old-fashioned manner. He used the standards of an ancient swordsman to judge his disciples. On the Thousand Elegance Peak, he was the martial uncle that everyone feared. In his hands, he would always punish those who offended him severely. When we cultivate, we observe with our hearts. Do we need to determine the truth of what is going on? Since Kuan Dao Li Realm had sent such a message, it meant that the other party had a certain attitude. Kuan Dao Li Realm rarely did this, but since it did, it must be intolerable. In my opinion, we should not be tolerated and should be severely punished. Weijin Mountain is willing to expel their own disciples from the sect for 3 years to see what happens. I, Xianyuan, am the righteous leader of the sect. Of course, I cannot lose my sense of righteousness over these small matters. Gu Dong's words were true and held the moral high ground. No one could refute them. However, Xianyuan had always been cautious when it came to expelling their own disciples. It was not something that could be swayed by a few words from an old antique. The other Jin Dan hesitated. He knew that his information might be unfavorable to this disciple, but he could not hide it due to his principles of fairness. Just now, Weijin Mountain sent a message saying that the cigarette but was indeed improper. The evidence is conclusive. Humph. Gu Dong harumphed hatefully, showing his dissatisfaction towards these fellow disciples who were always trying to protect their own. He did not even need to guess to know what these people were thinking. What was the big deal about taking advantage of others? Xianyuan's swordsman going out to take advantage of others was a matter of course, no matter which aspect it was. As expected, Gu Lin coughed lightly and said, "Well, let me interrupt. This could also be a mutual consent, a mutual affinity. Who knows? Maybe the tortoise saw the mung bean and they fell in love." Gu Dong was furious. In just a few days, they fell in love? Has this tortoise never seen the mung bean before? Gu Lin sternly said, "Senior brother, you're wrong. You've been alone all your life. You've never married a wife or a Dao companion. Maybe in this aspect, you're a little, unfamiliar? We swordsmen have always been clean and efficient. Once our swords are drawn, we have no regrets. In this aspect, how can we be like mortals? How can we need to spend countless time together, break in and test each other, rich and poor, noble and lowly, high and low? How could these worldly matters be placed in the eyes of cultivators? This life's fate is cultivated in 3 lifetimes. Isn't it just a matter of a glance? A second glance is superfluous. That's a Hua from next door." Gushan also said, "Senior brother, that woman is also a foundation establishment cultivator. She's not a chi eater, and she's definitely not a mortal. If you say that I, a Xianyuan swordsman, used force to kill her, I'll believe it. If you say that I used force to do that, I won't believe it. It's obvious that the two of them fell in love with each other." Who doesn't know that Boating Ting Island is a place filled with mung beans? It's completely normal for them to fall in love. The palace masters under them had been in contact with the Foundation establishment disciples for a long time, so they all had feelings for them. They wouldn't lightly punish them unless they committed a heinous crime. However, Jean Dan, who came from the Soaring Heaven Pavilion, was detached from the masses. They usually didn't come in contact with the Foundation establishment disciples. They were aloof, so they were used to strictly enforcing the rules. As a result, they were divided into 2 factions, unable to come to an agreement. No one was willing to yield. This was the good thing about being in the cultivation world. Everyone relied on their own ability to climb up. No one was inferior to anyone, so there was no need to flatter anyone. Unless your realm was higher than mine, don't even think about making me shut up. It seemed that they couldn't come to a conclusion. The Soaring Heaven Pavilion had more authority, and the various palace halls had more people. They were evenly matched. Gu Gang, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke up. He had come on behalf of Palace Master Guhi. Originally, he didn't want to get involved in these official squabbles, but since it was related to a disciple he was familiar with, he couldn't just sit by and watch. Once he opened his mouth, it represented the attitude of the Ascension Palace. This was the main palace hall that managed the Foundation establishment disciples. Its weight wasn't light. Arguing back and forth without even figuring out the truth, it'll be a joke if it gets out. My intention is to directly send a message to the Kuan Dao Li realm and ask for the details before deciding how to deal with it. The continuous transmission of information required resources. Moreover, if it was used frequently, it would be very easy for their opponents, such as the Supreme Sect and the 3 Pure Ones, to find out about their contact method. When the time came, they would have the opportunity to give you a deadly fake news, which would cause problems. Therefore, unless there was an important matter, they would generally not use it. After a period of time, they would even change the contact method as a precaution. The current set of contact keys had already been used for nearly 100 years. According to the agreement of both sides, it would be changed after 100 years. In any case, it was going to be changed, so it didn't matter how many times it was used. This was where Gu Gang's intention lay. No one thought of this detail, but they felt that it was very reasonable. This Ascension Palace Vice Palace Master was very experienced and meticulous in handling matters, so they all agreed. Very quickly, the Kuan Dao Li realm sent back a message. Gu Gang, as the operator, picked up the letter so that everyone could read it with their divine sense. Chapter 373. P.S. Let the old man catch his breath. He's already been hollowed out. Gu Gang's tone was calm, as if he was talking about something that had nothing to do with him. There are a few key points. Please pay attention to them. The reason why Cigarette, but was seen as not being united, was because he single-handedly cut off the thoughts of the 3 Pure Ones. He killed 2 people and defeated 2 people. The 3 Pure Ones were unwilling to continue the bet that they were bound to lose, so they stopped the bet with the reason that Cigarette, but was a disciple of Xianyuan. However, The three Pure Ones' plan did not succeed because Weijian Mountain prepared a ceremony for Cigarette, but to enter Weijian Mountain in advance. In the three families of Swordvein, this situation is very common. When Weijian Mountain disciples come to the western regions for missions, many of them will enter the sect before I enter the hall. In other words, if we expel Cigarette, but from Xianyuan, he will only have one identity left, a disciple of Weijian Mountain. There's another point. The first report of Kuan Dao was actually written by Weijian Mountain. Everyone stared at each other. They were all human. Once the letter was written, who didn't know what was going on? With this premise, in fact, the so-called rumors about the Kuan Dao cultivators were dispelled. As for the disciple of Weijian Mountain, needless to say, it was also a smokescreen to seduce Xianyuan. Gudong's face was red. He was slapped in the face. Weijian Mountain is a group of scum. Who's the leader? These few reports did not mention who was the leader of the Weijian Mountain group, but the news before the battle mentioned it. Ajin Dan chuckled. Senior brother Gudong, it's your old friend, Yin Yi. He knows you very well. He knows that if he says this, you will definitely jump out and advocate for the expulsion of disciples. Then, Xuan Yuan's talents will become Weijian Mountains. If the martial uncles know about this, I'm afraid you can only go to Zhonglao Peak to grow vegetables. Gudong was flustered and exasperated. He and Yin Yi had known each other for a lifetime and had fought together many times. He did not expect that when he was old, he would almost be buried by his old friend. When I see that bastard, I'll chop off his dog head. Everyone laughed. It was just a joke. If they really fought, Gudong would not be Yin Ye's opponent. From the perspective of an external sword, they were very clear about Wei Jinshan's strength. It was not something they could compare to. Therefore, those golden core cultivators who did not recognize the cigarette but were very curious. When did a tiger appear in their backyard? The tiger was currently touring Tinghai with someone else. He had unexpectedly caught the eye of a beauty and was very pleased with himself. He didn't know if he was still dizzy at the sight of blood. He needed to prove it, but now was obviously not the time to prove it. In 3 days, the two of them toured all the famous and unknown beautiful scenery around Tinghai Island. For someone like him who liked to be close to nature, he was greatly satisfied, whether it was from a psychological or physical point of view. He also didn't know how he ended up together with Han Yan. If it was someone else like those beauties he met at the dome, he would definitely refuse because it wasn't troublesome enough. If it was his senior apprentice sister, well, maybe he would think about it. But on Fangting Island, in this beautiful paradise on Earth, with such a clean and spotless girl like Han Yan together, he didn't even have the thought of refusing. Just like when he first saw her, he felt that they were the same kind of people. Now, if the two of them read their names together, one word could be omitted. Han Yin-Yi. He was now considering whether he should put most of his energy and time in Arai. There was also a sword vein here, and he also had a close Taoist companion. This kind of life was a combination of work and rest. It was much better than cultivating bitterly. Tomorrow, they would leave Weijian Mountain, but he wanted to stay for a while longer. Now that they were in a difficult situation, how could they leave just like that? The two of them flew to a big rock by the sea, and Han Yin landed. The two of them stood side by side. The woman was as beautiful as a fairy, and the man was as handsome as a tree in the wind. Well, even if he was not as handsome as a tree in the wind, he was probably a pine tree in the wind. This place is called Wangfu Rock. It is a legend among mortals because the sea is their natural moat. But it is the same for cultivators. In the world of cultivators, there are more such natural moats, and they are even more difficult to cross. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. So profound, so reasonable. When I am with you, I feel that my level has been raised. Han Yin rolled her eyes at him. That is in your eyes. In the eyes of all the cultivators of Kuan Dao, it is my level that has been raised. Little Ecump, sit down. I have something to say. Lu Xiaoyi was somewhat confused. He had a premonition that this might be a very important matter, but he had no clue at all. Han Yin looked at the obedient Lu Xiaoyi and sighed in her heart. Who would have thought that the bloodthirsty demon who had slaughtered everyone in the arena with the 3 pure ones was actually such a quiet big child in private? The relationship between men and women between cultivators was basically divided into two types. One type was commonly known as Tao companions. Under the strict scrutiny of both parties like merchants, they would put each of their own things on a scale to weigh, calculate, and evaluate in order to find every trace of something that might be useful to them for many years to come. Tao companions, Tao companions, Tao first, then companions. Looking for companions was for Tao. This was the principle. It had nothing to do with feelings. The other type only needed a glance. They did not need to consider family, wealth, status, strength, sect, future. Just a glance, relying on the intuition that cultivators gradually formed in their cultivation. To the two of them, their different origins made them trust their intuition even more. This was the reason why Han Yin saw Lu Xiaoyi among the 5 swordsmen of Weijin Mountain at a glance, and Lu Xiaoyi also saw Han Yin among the 8 flower-like beauties at a glance. This was a mysterious attraction that came from their previous lives. There was no need to say much, and there was also no need for long contact. They could be Tao companions, and they could also be lifelong friends. These were not important. What was important was that they knew that maintaining each other's hearts was the most important. But Han Yin knew that it should end here. In terms of temperament, she was more mature than Lu Xiaoyi. This was also a woman's characteristic. Therefore, she should be the one to end it. At the very least, it should be a temporary end. The two of them had too long a path to walk, too many experiences to go through. The result of helping each other was that one of them would definitely fall behind in the end. Because of concern, they would lose their original perseverance. This was impossible for the first type of Tao companions to exist, because they were not true companions. Concern was a good thing, and maintaining assistance would allow them to get through the current crisis. Unfortunately, they could never achieve a balance. In the end, one person could only become the other's protector, and the other person could become the other's pet. This was not the eternity that true cultivators pursued. What a true cultivator pursued was a beautiful memory. They let the memories slowly ferment in their memories, becoming mellow and rich, with endless aftertastes. They were both too young, and being young made it easy for people to make mistakes. It was easy for them to see the present as eternity. It was impossible to say who took the initiative and who was passive. Both of them were completely willing. But since she was the one who started it on the surface, then she should also be the one to end it. It was a good beginning and a good ending. Taoists paid particular attention to this. Chapter 374. Starting tomorrow, I'm going into seclusion. Otherwise, if this continues, I'll be left behind by you. Han Yin played it down. There were some things that didn't need to be said clearly. Lily wasn't that stupid. However, what she didn't know was that she was very clear about her past, but this man knew nothing about his. Lu Xiaoyi naturally understood. He was indeed very inexperienced in some aspects, but he was also very experienced in others. Saying this at this time, on the eve of Weijin Mountain's departure, meant something. He wasn't surprised, because he knew this woman was unusual. He looked forward to getting along with her for a while, but he didn't expect this time to be so short. He knew that separation was good for everyone's cultivation. An eagle that just learned how to fly shouldn't have a nest to tie them down. There were many things that could be proven with time. Separation wasn't the goal, but a better reunion in the future. He understood, but some gentleness could wear down a person's will. He gently stroked her long hair. We have to set a date for our next meeting, right? He didn't say that he would come to Boating Ting Island to see her. They needed to respect each other. This was a tacit understanding between cultivators. From the day they stepped into cultivation, they were no longer mortals. The love between mortals no longer belonged to them. Men and women who cultivated didn't pursue day and night. What they pursued was that when one of them took a step forward, the other could also follow. They didn't want to drag each other down. Han Yin thought about it. Regarding Lu Xiaoyi, although they had only known each other for less than 10 days, she was very clear that this person's biggest problem was laziness. If no one urged him, he would continue to be lazy and undisciplined, not seeking to improve himself. Then, let's meet in Jindan. We'll meet in Jindan. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. That's not fair. Han Yin was already in the late stage of foundation establishment, one step away from the peak stage. However, he was in the middle stage of foundation establishment, one step away from the late stage. The gap between them wasn't small. He knew this woman was spurring him on, but he preferred to be free and unrestrained. She pulled Lu Xiaoyi's hand over and put on her chest. Listen, it's telling you, don't put yourself in danger. Don't think that you can look down on the heroes of the world just because you're strong. Don't think that just because you're from Xianyuan, everyone will spoil you. If something happens to you, I won't be able to save you. Similarly, if something happens to me, you will also be dragged into the whirlpool. Don't let us become a burden to the other. I can do it, what about you? Lu Xiaoyi also pulled her hand over and placed it on his heart. I could do it too. In the future, my experiences might be more exciting than yours. If you hear that I'm in some kind of desperate situation, don't worry. Don't reach out and wait patiently. That might just be a trap that I've dug for others. Han Yin sighed. You have already dug a hole for me. The next day, Lu Xiaoyi didn't bid farewell, and Han Yin didn't come to send them off. Just like this, the group of people from Weijian Mountain boarded Taoist Yinyes' flying boat and set off for Weijian Mountain. Lan Cheng, one of the swordsmen from Weijian Mountain, was very curious. Xiaoyi, why didn't you stay on Fangding Island? Or bring that girl to Weijian Mountain too? Lu Xiaoyi snorted. If you like to eat chicken dumplings, why would you bring an old hen with you? Or live in a chicken coop? Weijian Mountain? Is that a place for people to live? Other than swords, there's nothing. Yi, who was steering the boat, nodded to himself. He was a Xianyuan descendant indeed. Not only did he pull up his pants, but he also refused to admit it. Very well. Lu Xiaoyi looked down on Weijian Mountain scenery. Everyone was attacking, but there was one person who remained silent. Lu Xiaoyi found it strange. Senior brother Lan Cheng, what's wrong with you? Are you missing Xiao Jian as soon as you left Fangting Island? Lan Cheng was frustrated. Miss my foot. I didn't even have a bite of meat. Thanks to you, I was kicked out of the sect for 3 years. The teleportation formation was only available in Weijian Mountain. Kuan Dao Li did not have one. It was not a matter of setting it up, but other considerations. From the perspective of safety, Fangting Island did not have the ability to withstand a wave of attacks from the top forces. Setting up a formation on the island would make Kuan Dao more conspicuous and become a thorn in the side of martial cultivators. After all, the core of their alliance was Sword Alliance. Therefore, the teleportation formation of the core was only available in the Three-Sword Vein. Weijian Mountain was a place that was even more ruthless than Xianyuan. It was so ruthless that it was unreasonable. It was the wildest of the 3 core forces of Sword Alliance. Xianyuan Sword Sect was more magnanimous and reasonable due to their strength and status. They had the elites of Inner Sword and the cannon fodder of Outer Sword. It was a rather balanced system. Firmament Sword Sect was more low-key. As a sect that purely relied on Inner Sword, their limited numbers made it difficult for them to be high-profile. It was fine to be high-profile once, but if they were high-profile a few times, they would be gone. Weijian Mountain was a sect that showed its wildness to the outside world. They had always been like this, and it was also their protective color. Every sect had its own way of survival. Some were tolerant, while others were flamboyant. Those who were tolerant were not necessarily toothless. Those who were flamboyant were not necessarily brainless. It was all for survival. Weijian Mountain's location was not originally called this. It was added by the invaders when the 5 rings were first established. As for what it was called before, who cared about it after tens of thousands of years? This was a barren iron mine mountain. Red mineral soil covered the entire mountain area. The mineral deposits were cheap and had no value to be mined. Even plants could not grow here. In the eyes of Taoists, this was not a place to hold court. However, Wei Jianshan liked this place. They almost pushed their way of cultivation to the extreme. They did not allow any extravagance that would affect their spiritual will to spread in the sect. This was the world of the sword. There was nothing else, including the dilapidated buildings. Not to mention that it did not look like an immortal's home, Even the buildings in the mortal world were better than this. This philosophy made the swordsmen of Weijian Mountain fearless. No one was willing to provoke such a barefoot person. This was their way of survival. However, it was also because of this biased way of life that in the later stages, after a cultivator became a monarch, it was very difficult to climb up. In the words of the Dharma Meridian, there was no immortal chi. There was no Taoist freedom. It was just a ruffian in the cultivation world. The Five Rings was huge and had a large population. There were tens of billions of people. The base of the cultivator population was here. This determined that everyone had their own hobbies. Although the people who entered Weijian Mountain were basically here to suffer, with the base here, Weijian Mountain was still able to survive. There was no lack of suitable foundation establishment cultivators. In the Xianyuan Dome, the foundation establishment cultivators who joined Xianyuan were definitely aiming for the inner sword. If they could not obtain the sword pill, they would settle for the second best and become an outer swordsman. They would have a congenital defect in their temperament and would need time to make up for it. The foundation establishment cultivators who chose to join Weijian Mountain were different. They were here to be outer swords. They had a clear goal and a firm will. This was probably a very important reason why Xuanyuan's outer swords could not compare to Weijian Mountain's outer swords. Chapter 375. Lu Xiaoyi planned to stay in Weijian Mountain for a period of time. If possible, he hoped to have a few years to learn new things in Weijian Mountain. This was what Yinyi promised him. As the sharpest outer sword sect in the Five Rings, Weijian Mountain had something that Qinshu Peak didn't. He hoped to find this point. At the same time, he could also avoid the endless harassment from the palace halls on Qinshu Peak. Yinyi called out to him. He needed a further rope in this external sword genius. No matter which sect it was, they would invest in their own outstanding disciples regardless of the cost. As long as one of them could slowly walk up, all the investments would be repaid. Xianyuan had already sent back news. They were all cursing, threatening, and greeting him and the people around him. He didn't care. He was already used to it. When Xianyuan took advantage of him, they also cursed him like this. Gu Dong actually wanted to fight him one-on-one. They had known each other for a few hundred years. How could he not know what that guy was capable of? A loser was nothing to talk about. All of this was within his expectations. There weren't many idiots like Gu Dong in Qinshu Peak. His plan was a gamble. What if it succeeded? It didn't matter if it didn't succeed. Anyway, this Lu Xiaoyi was officially listed in Weijian Mountain's sword book. It couldn't be erased. Who asked Xianyuan to be so stupid to send his genius disciple over? If he didn't take him, he would be letting the heavens down. He needed to be more careful with this swordsman. Yinyi was very confident. He knew very well what could move a swordsman. Do you plan to travel in Arai? Or return to Qinshu Peak? Yinyi said casually. Lu Xiaoyi replied honestly, it doesn't seem appropriate to travel. The three pure ones are too powerful in Arai. This disciple doesn't want to go there and look for trouble. This disciple wants to stay in Weijian Mountain for a while as long as the sect doesn't summon me. This disciple has admired the swordsmanship of Weijian Mountain for a long time. I want to use this opportunity to fulfill my long-cherished wish. I hope Martial Uncle can grant me my wish. Yinyi nodded with satisfaction. That was a very wise idea. Weijian Mountain would not give him a mission in Arai. Although Lu Xiaoyi was a disciple of Weijian Mountain in name, it was not the same as Xianyuan. He would not be so stupid to squeeze the value out of this disciple now. There were plenty of swordsmen in Weijian Mountain. There was no shortage of people. In Arai, the three pure ones were extraordinarily powerful. No one could guarantee the safety of a disciple if they went out and wandered around. Cultivation was not only about going out to wander around, but also about honing one's sword skills and cultivation in a mountain gate. When a situation was tense, one should stay at home and cultivate hard. When a situation was over, one should go out and wander around. This was the basic rule of every cultivator. But that was not what he wanted to say. The cultivation technique of Weijian Mountain is open to you. Since you are already a disciple of Weijian Mountain, you have the same rights as everyone else. But I still want to advise you to choose carefully. There is a primary and secondary cultivation technique. Do not seek perfection. If you go astray in Weijin Mountain, there will be a lot of people who will find trouble with me. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. Of course, he understood that the things of Weijin Mountain could only be a supplement and not another system. But you might not know that in the inheritance of Weijin Mountain swordsmanship, there's one thing that Xuanyuan's external sword cannot compare to. That is the sword case. Yi looked proudly at the simple sword case on Lu Xiaoyi's back. His heart was filled with pride. Facing the puzzled gaze of the little swordsman, he explained, "There are two types of scabbards for external swords. The first type is the scabbards of your Xianyuan sword sect. The scabbards only focus on nurturing the sword. You carry it on your back every day and immerse your spiritual power in it every day so that you can control it as you wish. This is the most basic function of the scabbards. The other type is the sword case of Weijin Mountain. Our sword case is different from others. It comes from Weijin Mountain's most famous spirit case world. It is filled with all kinds of heavenly materials and earthly treasures. The sword case nurtured in this way is stronger than ordinary sword cases. Most importantly, it has the effect of nurturing the sword spirit. If a foundation establishment, Jin Dan cultivator, carries it, the chances of the flying sword having a spirit will increase greatly. If a cultivator with a spirit flying sword carries it, the sword spirit will automatically be trained in the case. After a long time, the difference will naturally show. If I'm not wrong, your flying sword already has a spirit, right?" Lu Xiaoyi did not hide it. Senior's eyes are as sharp as a torch. Indeed has a spirit. Otherwise, Taoist three purities would not be in such a sorry state. Yi chuckled. "When you took out your flying sword, I guess this was the case. Otherwise, no matter how much you cultivate a normal flying sword, it would not be able to reach such a degree of sharpness. In that case, let me ask you again. Since your flying sword already has a spirit, how did you nurture it?" Lu Xiaoyi was very honest. Xuanyuan's boa pavilion did not have a similar technique. Therefore, I went to the fan pavilion of the inner sword. There, I obtained a technique to train a sword spirit. From then on, I cultivated it and made great progress. Yi laughed. "I knew it. I also went to the boa pavilion. Your Xuanyuan's external swords are all fake. There are tens of thousands of techniques, but how many of them are actually useful? Only 10 or 20% of them are used. The rest are just for show. Truly laughable. Xuanyuan's external swords at the foundation establishment Jin Dan level can't nurture a spirit. The lack of techniques is not the main reason. The lack of a suitable sword case is the main reason. Without a mother, where would an infant come from? Therefore, in the later stages of Jin Dan, my Weijin Mountain's swordsmen gradually began to have a sword spirit in their flying swords. However, your Xuanyuan's external swords can forget about it. Once you reach the Yuanying level, almost all of us can nurture a sword spirit in our own flying swords. However, your Xuanyuan's external swords are only a small portion. You still have to rely on luck. This is the main reason for the gap in strength between the two external sword vein. Lu Xiaoyi suddenly understood. He had always wondered why Xuanyuan's external swords, which had such a good cultivation environment, had been suppressed by Weijin Mountain for tens of thousands of years. What was the reason? Was it only because of faith? That did not seem to be entirely correct. Just like Xuanyuan's sword tomb small world, Weijin Mountain also had its own unique item, the space of spirit box. This was the unique treasure of every sword vein that could survive in this world. It was irreplaceable. In this world, there were many individual cultivators who wanted to rely on their own efforts to cultivate swordsmanship. However, in the end, they achieved nothing. This was because they did not have the most crucial and most basic support. This was not something that could be solved by talent. This unique treasure was not easily shown to others or shared, even among the sword sects that have been close for tens of thousands of years. Xianyuan would not provide the sword pill to the firmament sword sect for free. Similarly, Weijin Mountain would not give away their sword case. They were already somewhat lacking in using it. Xian Yuan had 20,000 foundation establishment cultivators waiting for them. How could they afford to give it away? Of course, there were always exceptions. For example, a genius disciple of the Firmament Sword sect wanted to ask for a sword pill from Xian Yuan. For example, the most outstanding external swordsman of the Qianxiu Peak wanted to ask for a sword case from Weijian Mountain. These were all possible. They would not break the balance. Chapter 376. Lu Xiaoyi was very tempted. There was nothing he couldn't accept. He had risked his life in the arena. Not only did he help the Kuan Daoli world, he also helped the Weijian Mountain indirectly. He made the Three Pure Ones plan to return the Aborigines come to an end. At the same time, he made sure that no one from the Weijian Mountain died and no one was injured. Most importantly, he was already listed in the Weijian Mountain disciple list. This was not an undeserved reputation. Weijian Mountain might not need him now, but once their relationship was stable, they would definitely use him when they were in trouble. I provided you with skills and sword case, and you helped me a certain time. This was the normal interaction in the cultivation world. There was no need to thank each other. Lu Xiaoyi was good at talking. At this time, of course, he could not wait for the other party to beg for a sword case. It was necessary to lower his status appropriately. Even if he was from Xian Yuan, even if he had great potential. Martial uncle, I also want to ask for a sword case. Of course, if there is a surplus and it is not too abrupt. Yi nodded with satisfaction. No matter how talented he was only in foundation establishment. The reason why he wanted to rope this young man in was not only because he had unlimited potential, but also because he knew how to conduct himself. He did not want to feed an ingrate. There will never be a surplus sword case. Just like your Xuanyuan sword pill will always be in a state of lack. However, the sect has to leave some leeway for itself. If there are outstanding disciples, it should be rewarded. If there are incompetent disciples, it is useless to give them. In this battle, the people of Weijian Mountain are safe and sound. You have contributed greatly. Is the life of the swordsman of Weijian Mountain not worth a sword case? Come with me. Along the way, Yi explained to him, I have never been to Fan Lu. It is not related, so I don't know what method you found to cultivate the sword spirit of the inner sword. But there is one point. The method you found in Fan Lu must be closely related to the sword pill. It is a perfect match. The sword spirit of our outer sword flying sword is ultimately different from the sword pill. This is a fact. Let me guess, you must have brought the sword spirit of your flying sword into your sea of consciousness to train? Lu Xiaoyi sighed in admiration. Martial uncle is brilliant. That is indeed the case. The name of this technique is wave bursting slope. It requires a scene to be constructed in the sea of consciousness for the sword spirit to fight the waves. Yi lightly snorted. That's what I guessed. Because this was the most standard internal sword technique, they had no other tools to use, so they could only do it in the sea of consciousness. But have you ever thought that your flying sword isn't just a sword spirit? The flying sword itself was equally important. If you bring the sword spirit into the sea of consciousness to train every day, but leave the flying sword outside, in a state where the flying sword and the sword spirit are separated for a long time, I'm afraid that this kind of training will get half the result with twice the effort. Your current cultivation base is not high enough, so you might not be able to feel it. When your cultivation base increases and you spend more time with the flying sword, you will be able to feel the separation between the sword spirit and the flying sword. You won't be able to fuse with the flying sword. When that time comes, the flying sword will be destroyed. Lu Xiaoyi was moved. He really hadn't thought about this, but he always felt that the sword spirit's enhancement of the power of his flying swords was not satisfactory. He didn't know what was wrong. Now that an experienced Jin Dan like Yi reminded him, he finally understood where the problem was. That's right, the sword spirit can enter the sea of consciousness, but the flying sword can't. But the swordsman's final battle relies on the flying sword, not the sword spirit. In the long run, the sword spirit will become stronger, but the flying sword won't be able to keep up with the sword spirit's pace. Sooner or later, something will happen, Yi sternly said. After all, you haven't been immersed in the Tao of the flying sword for long. After obtaining the sword spirit, the time you spent nurturing the flying sword in the sea of consciousness is even shorter. Everything is still not too late. My Weijin Mountain sword box has this advantage. It nurtures the sword spirit and the flying sword as a whole. It allows these two to improve simultaneously. Of course, they will become more and more harmonious. They will become one, and there won't be any separation. Lu Xiaoyi still had some doubts. Won't this kind of gap get bigger and bigger? When a cultivator reaches Yuanying, or even higher, how can Xuanyuan's external swords compare to Weijin Mountain's external swords? Yi shook his head. You're wrong. When a cultivator reaches the realm of Yuanying, they will be able to travel in the void. The strength of their spirit is not something you can imagine. They have other ways to nurture the flying sword. For these, Xuanyuan's methods are not inferior to Weijin Mountain's. But we are strong in the early and middle stages of cultivators, and we can easily maintain this advantage. Therefore, when your Xuanyuan's external swords reach the realm of Grand Cultivator, the starting point is not as good as Weijin Mountain's. To most people, this kind of gap is hard to surpass. Therefore, the starting point is very important, and it's your current stage. Lu Xiaoyi followed Yi and passed through the dilapidated palace buildings of Weijin Mountain. Actually, if one looked carefully, one could see that the dilapidated palace buildings were only on the surface. There were no decorations inside, but the building materials were extremely sturdy. The pillars and walls of the palace were even sturdier than Xuanyuan's. Every palace building was designed as a fortress. For anything, the first consideration was whether it could be preserved in battle. They were really prepared to fight at any time. It was also because they were prepared at any time that the war would not come. Most of the important places of Weijin Mountain were half hidden under the ground, including the Haina Hall where the spiritual box was placed. Lu Xiaoyi did not see this spiritual box. He only stood in the hall and was examined by a few mysterious spiritual senses. They were existences that surpassed Jin Dan. He could not determine how high they were, but he thought that the power protecting in Weijin Mountain was similar to how Xianyuan protected the small world of the Sword Tomb, right? Yi communicated with a few words and indicated to Lu Xiaoyi to wait. It was obvious that the communication was very smooth. Xianyuan was born and had just entered Weijin Mountain. He had great potential. These conditions made the Grand Cultivators not refuse to open a back door for him. For tens of thousands of years, the three major powers of the sword vein had worked together to nurture their disciples with great potential. When one sect sent out an evildoer, the other two would do their best to help. They were all looking forward to the miracle that happened tens of thousands of years ago. After a while, 3 sword boxes floated down from the dome of the hall. These were directly taken out from the spiritual box by the Grand Cultivators in the hall. Yi reminded him at the side. In Weijin Mountain, normally every disciple has 3 sword boxes to choose from. Those who have contributed to the sect will be given 2 chances to choose from 6 sword boxes. The most outstanding and those who have contributed greatly will have 3 chances to choose from 9 sword boxes. You've made a great contribution in this battle, so the sect will give you 3 chances. You have to be careful and choose the one that is most compatible with you. This is the principle. The sword boxes that appear later will not be of higher quality. They are just randomly taken. There is no order. Lu Xiaoyi bowed and thanked Weijin Mountain for their kindness. Then, he placed his attention on the 3 sword boxes in front of him. In terms of color and appearance, there was not much difference, but there was something special about each of them. Chapter 377. Out of the 3 sword sheaths, one was fire-shaped, as if there was a fire essence in it. One was wood-shaped, as if it was full of life, and the last one was mysterious and unpredictable. These 3 sword sheaths were standard 80% to 90% solid. The remaining 10% to 20% still require the cultivator to perfect and refine according to their own characteristics. This was also the specialty of Weijian Mountain. They placed a lot of importance on sword sheaths, unlike Xuanyuan's sword sheaths, which were mass-produced goods. But this could not be blamed on Xuanyuan's lack of external swords. They did not have similar spirit sheaths and were helpless. Lu Xiaoyi's luck was not bad, because out of the 3 sword sheaths, there was a very rare spatial sword sheath. It could greatly increase the dark space ability of the flying sword. If the swordsman had a spatial assassination sword, this would be a match made in heaven. Lu Xiaoyi did indeed have a shadow attack sword that had nurtured a sword spirit. However, Hidden Fragrance didn't walk the path of space, but rather the more ordinary path of breath concealment. How should he choose? The Sword of Leaping attack was very high-end. It could greatly increase one's battle power. He also had the ability to refine another flying sword that was related to space. Whether it was in Weijian Mountain or in the Dome, it was not a difficult thing. He chose to give up because he was not focused on the shadow attack sword. He was focused on the first sword. The aspect that strengthened him the most was the principle that he had followed for the past 30 years. This principle had brought him brilliant battle results. What reason did he have to change it? As for the fire form and the wood form, he didn't consider them at all. Before he reached the peak of the power of the flying sword in the foundation establishment stage, he wouldn't consider the problem of the 5 elements. Considering these problems in the foundation establishment stage would only yield half the results with twice the effort, and the gains wouldn't make up for the losses. That was something to worry about after he reached the Jindan stage. The 3 sword sheaths disappeared mysteriously. No one said anything about his choice. He walked his own path. If he walked the wrong path, he could not blame anyone, including Yin Yi, who felt that it was a pity. In his opinion, this spatial sword sheath was very good. It was a sword sheath that had a very low chance of appearing. Unfortunately, this kid did not know what was good for him. Another 3 sword sheaths descended from the dome of the main hall. One of them was a water-type sword sheath with a supple nature. Another one was a wind-type sword sheath with a speed nature. And then another one was a fire-type sword sheath. It seemed to be the one from the first batch. Therefore, Lu Xiaoyi understood that this was really a random draw. The sword sheath that was drawn the first time was very likely to appear in the second draw. This also proved that there were actually not many sword sheaths that were completely formed in the space of the spirit case. The Aquasoft repair was very practical. It could repair the damage that the flying sword received in battle at the fastest speed. This included physical damage, as well as soft damage, such as spirit invasion. It was very practical, but his flying sword had a sword spirit, so he did not need it urgently. There was no need to mention the wind-shaped speed. Speed was the foundation of a flying sword, and there was no sword cultivator who did not like fast flying swords. However, Lu Xiaoyi had his own methods in this regard. For example, the continuous engraving of the speed sword formation of the 4 seasons was somewhat repetitive. He was somewhat unwilling to use such a rare opportunity on repetitive options. The fire-shaped sword box was completely ignored. Seeing him give up again, Yin Yi sighed again. He suspected that this fellow didn't understand the meaning of his words just now. The wind-type sword sheath was a very good choice, and it was also very rare. If it really didn't work out, the water-type sword sheath was also very practical, and it was very important for the maintenance of the flying sword. Today's draw at Hainan Hall was very lucky. There were 3 sword sheaths that were very hard to come by, but this brat did not choose any of them. Did he really want to hold back? How was that possible? He had been in Wei Sword Mountain for hundreds of years, and had seen all kinds of strange sword sheaths appearing, but he had never seen anything that was better than these 3 sword sheaths. Opportunities would not favor you forever, and if you missed it, it would not come again. Inye's thoughts were confirmed when the 3 sword sheaths appeared for the 3rd time. The first one was a fire-type sword sheath. The second one was also a fire-type sword sheath. This was not strange at all, because the nature of the spirit sheath space leaned towards the fire attribute of the 5 elements. So there were many fire-type sword sheaths. Not to mention 2 appearing at once. Even 3 fire-type sword sheaths appearing at once was very common. The third one was a normal strength sword sheath, second only to the fire-type sword sheath, And this one was even more of a half-finished product, because it was different from the other 8 sword sheaths that were 80 to 90% solid. It was only 50% solid, and it was more like a half-finished product. It still needed the cultivator to complete the other 50%. With the ability of a foundation establishment cultivator, this kind of replenishment was very difficult. The key was, if you replenished too many things, would it affect the effectiveness of the sword sheath itself? The choice failed. At least that was how Yi saw it. Lu Xiaoyi had a different view from him. To be honest, he was taking a big risk, and he did not think that others would give him face to choose a 4th time. Others had rules, but he had his pride, and this was the last time. He felt that he was a lucky person. Sure enough, in the last 3 choices, a sword sheath that made his eyes light up appeared, and it was the half-finished strength sword sheath. He liked strength, and he thought that a mere foundation establishment cultivator should just honestly study strength. What was the use of making something so grand? What if they could not understand it? It was not that being grand was bad, but at the current stage, they simply could not understand it thoroughly. They could only see the big picture and obtain some vague, superficial knowledge. Rather than this, it was better to practice simple strength to the extreme. He did not expect that the strength sword sheath, which was usually very common, would appear so rarely this time. Instead, there were some grand quality sword sheaths, and this made his test even more intense. Fortunately, he persevered with his heart, and luck finally returned to him. This sword sheath, the nature of strength, was secondary. What he valued the most was actually its 50% solid form. 50% solid form meant that the other 50% needed to be replenished by himself. In his philosophy, what was the most suitable for him? None of the sword sheaths in the spirit sheath space were suitable. Only the things he made himself were the things that truly suited him the most. He had the sword spirits to help him, and in this 50% replenishment, he could perfectly fulfill the requirements of the sword spirits, and this was the best choice for him. Before seeing this sword sheath, he was not sure what he wanted, because he did not know that the so-called solid form was not all 80 or 90%. There was actually a 50% solid form. So when he saw this sword sheath, he immediately knew that this was what he wanted. Without hesitation, he took off the sword sheath and bowed towards the empty space again. This was to thank the old senior who took the sword sheath for him. The senior might not need it, but he could not do it. The choice had been made, and the next thing was his business, whether to destroy this sword sheath or to complete his plan. This required careful planning, and he actually did not have much confidence. Chapter 378. You want to refine your own box? Do you know the difficulty of doing so? Yi was experienced and had sharp eyes. He quickly saw something from Lu Xiaoyi's choice. This was a very bold idea and also very crazy. Of course, it was very swordsman. Refining a box was very difficult. It wasn't difficult because of the preciousness of the materials, the level of the magic power, whether one could control the mind, whether one had profound knowledge of refining. These were not the reason. The biggest reason was that the sword box produced from the spirit box space was not the inanimate sword box from Xinyuan. The reason why it was precious and rare was because it had spirituality. Because it had spirituality, it was very possible for the cultivator to lose this spirituality due to improper handling during the process of refining their own things. The possibility of this was not small. Even a normal 80% or a 90% solid sword box was often destroyed by people, not to mention this 50% solid sword box. After all, in the foundation establishment realm, there was very little knowledge about the abstract fields of spirit, mystery, inexplicability, and spirituality. It was impossible for them to reach the level of a major cultivator. When half of a spirituality sword box required the cultivator to refine their own things, failure was almost unavoidable. I have a sword spirit. It can help me. Lu Xiaoyi explained softly. Yi was startled and immediately realized that this was indeed an effective way. Using a sword spirit with innate spirituality to help refine the sword box, it should be able to preserve the spirituality of the sword box to the greatest extent, right? He realized that his brain wasn't working well. He couldn't understand the young man. If this was indeed a way, then the sword box and the cultivator could achieve the most perfect fit. But the problem was, who could create a sword spirit in the Foundation establishment realm? Once a flying sword had a life, it would give birth to countless possibilities. However, these possibilities couldn't be easily replicated. They were unique. Want to learn? You have to create a sword spirit first. All right, you can use my sword talisman to get what you need from the warehouse outside Weijian Mountain. However, it's only limited to this one time. This was the only way Yin Yi could help him. Lu Xiaoyi was very surprised. Martial uncle, Weijian Mountain still has a warehouse. Yin Yi scolded with a smile. You look down on us just because our place is shabby? Let me tell you, not only is there an outer treasury, there's also an inner treasury. Let's see if you have the ability to enter. Also, I want to warn you, use it sparingly. Don't use up the rest of my life's quota. At that time, all of us will have to go out and beg for food. Lu Xiaoyi agreed with a smile. He was starting like the big family of Swordvane. Although the people he met were always strange, they spared no effort in helping their disciples. Lu Xiaoyi was not stupid, but he never said words of gratitude because he always felt that words like thank you or sorry were the palest words in the human world. There was no need to say anything. Just wait for an opportunity. Now that he had returned to the dead Fei Chai's cave, it was like he was a dove occupying a sparrow's nest. He needed to be careful with the refinement of the sword sheath. Confidence was one thing. Meticulousness was another. All of you go in. Go take a look at your new home. Think about what needs to be changed. How? Lu Xiaoyi chased the three unwilling sword spirits inside. They knew that their father was up to something again. There are a few things you need to take note of. In the future, you might have more brothers and sisters, so don't be stifled. If you feel that you're lacking in any aspect, tell us and we will think of a solution. There is still half of the space. What materials are needed? What goals are achieved? Everyone has to speak up. There was one good thing about sword spirits. No matter if they were willing or not, they would not lie. In the next few months, no one came to disturb him. This was a little inconceivable because as a famous person in the Weijian Mountain Foundation establishment circle, there were many who wanted to drink and compete with him. However, these were all stopped by Yin Yi, including Xuanyuan's letter urging him to return. Yin Yi's words were very shameless. This person was reluctant to part with his woman and was too happy to think about home. His goal was very simple. He wanted to help this kid refine his own sword case and completely establish a relationship with Weijian Mountain. In this way, half of this disciple with great potential would belong to Weijian Mountain. This is a good deal. A few months later, Lu Xiaoyi, who had been concentrating on studying the sword case, had a rough idea of what to do. The materials were all ready. The foundation of a sect was not something that an individual could understand. The embryonic form of the sword case was gradually reached after months of arguments between him and the three sword spirits. There was a definite plan that was acceptable to all parties. There was no need to waste any more time. Some things could not be foolproof the longer one thought about it. There was always a limit. On the contrary, if one was too careful, they would be overcautious. Cultivation was a gamble, including all aspects of cultivation. On this day, Lu Xiaoyi adjusted himself to his best condition and also restored the three sword spirits to their peak condition. They would go all out today, and if they did not succeed, or if they did not destroy the sword sheath, they would not stop. The first step of refining was to carry the sword case on their backs. Lu Xiaoyi did not forget to threaten them. Work hard. Be careful. If any of you burn but while refining, you can wait to swim in the surf for the rest of your life. You're not allowed to take half a step onto the shore. The three sword spirits responded in unison. Their momentum was very strong. Lu Xiaoyi cheered everyone on first. Then, he slowly injected his magic power into the sword case. He had done this countless of times in the past few months. He was very familiar with it. In an instant, he felt that he had complete control over the sword case. Thus, he threw a few materials into the sword case. His magic power melted and turned into different liquids, making it easier to construct. The three sword spirits were already prepared. Each of them pushed the materials that belonged to their task and set up the foundation in the sword case. They were all spiritual beings. Of course, they knew what they could touch and what they could not touch in the sword case. Just like the original sword case was in embryonic form, the three of them were hard-working masters. With the materials provided by the old master, they provided an endless supply of magic power and spiritual support to give the embryonic form a new function. It was a composition that had been discussed countless times. There was nothing to hesitate or argue about. For things like refining the sword case, it was best to do it in one go. The most taboo was to hesitate and change halfway. The sword case gradually took shape under the combined efforts of one person and three spirits. It showed its embryonic form according to the plan. Everything went smoothly. This was to be expected. The months of preparation were not in vain. It was the result of Lu Xiaoyi's repeated weighing and considering the possible difficulties to the extreme. Very quickly, the sword case's solidification reached the threshold of 90%. Now, it was completely clear what his goal was. This was an enlarged version of the real Bolang slope. But now, this Bolang slope was bigger and had more steps. It could accommodate more flying swords at the same time. It had also increased the level from 13 steps to 99 steps. Countless rare materials were needed for this. But Lu Xiaoyi was a child selling his father's land. He did not feel any heartache. To his sect, what was the consumption of cultivator? But he forgot that this might not be much to Wei Jinshan, but it was a big deal to Yin Yi. Chapter 379. When the sword sheath was 90% solidified, there was the first unexpected change. The entire sword sheath trembled intensely, as if it was resonating. But in reality, the spirituality of the sword sheath had sensed danger and was fighting for control of the sword sheath. Lu Xiaoyi naturally couldn't give the initiative to it. The best way was to use spirituality to suppress the spirituality and replace it with a sword spirit. However, this also meant that he would lose a sword spirit that he had nurtured for many years. He couldn't bear to part with it, and neither was the sword spirit. No sword spirit was willing to become a case spirit. They yearned for the feeling of flying, killing enemies, and drinking blood. Without hesitation, he patted looting. The heavenly pure sand that had turned into an illusory Bolang slope in his sea of consciousness rushed out of looting and into the sword case. He was more inclined to control the sword case himself. He had refined the heavenly pure sand for many years. He hoped that he could suppress the spirituality of the sword case and merge the two into one. If it didn't work, he would definitely lose a sword spirit. He had no choice. The heavenly pure sand sank into the sword case. It was an illusory object, so it didn't need a sword spirit to push it. It could automatically act according to Lu Xiaoyi's will. This illusory spiritual power rolled and unfolded in the sword case. It had already wrapped the spirituality of the sword case and assimilated it in an instant before spreading it out again. At this stage, it was more daunting than dangerous. The refining of the solid form advanced steadily towards the final form, but the speed also began to slow down. This was the final and most crucial step. Lu Xiaoyi, as well as the three sword spirits, were all doing their best. There was no time to rest and take a breather. Lu Xiaoyi didn't expect that the last 10% would consume so much magic power. He could only grit his teeth and endure. Finally, it was the final moment. However, the sword case was still incomplete. It didn't produce a sword cry, as if it was missing a breath. He had a feeling that this sword case needed a flying sword to sacrifice to the case. His choice was to choose between the Big Dipper sword and the Tiger God sword. He chose the Tiger God. The flying sword entered the case and was immediately refined into nothingness by a powerful force. The sword case produced a sword cry that shook the heavens. At the same time, a newborn sword spirit was born within. It cried helplessly. "Where's my body?" In that instant, Lu Xiaoyi received two benefits. The completion of the sword case and the sword's cry was proof of life. At the same time, the titanic flying sword had also given birth to a sword spirit. The problem was that the titanic flying sword itself had been reduced to nothingness. In other words, the newly born sword spirit had become a sword spirit that could only exist in the sword sheath and didn't have its own flying sword body. He didn't have time to feel the feeling of the sword sheath being formed. He had to first appease the newly born sword spirit. This was the moment when it was at its weakest. It was just like when a little beast opened its eyes and habitually treated the first creature it saw as its mother. Lu Xiaoyi threw the Big Dipper flying sword in as well. He coaxed Little Four. "How about you use this flying sword first?" The soaring god sword spirit touched it for a moment before moving away in disgust, indicating that it did not like it. She was quite hard to serve. Lu Xiaoyi continued to coax. "How about I find you a blank sword embryo? Start from scratch. Only the cleanest paper can draw the most beautiful paintings." Gu Bei still had one of the 3 sword embryos that he hadn't used yet. He couldn't care less about that now. He took it out to make up the numbers. This newly born sword spirit didn't have a flying sword body, so it would be very easy for it to collapse. Therefore, he had to hurry. However, the soaring god sword spirit didn't pay any attention to this blank sword. It still had that arrogant look on its face. This made Lu Xiaoyi feel a little helpless. Where was he going to find a flying sword that matched the soaring god sword spirit's nature in such a short time? The soaring god was a flying sword that attacked the mind. Nurturing, it was very troublesome. However, this arrogant sword spirit had found a way to exist on its own. It looked at the 4 seasons, Ju Cheng, and hidden fragrance fighting in the waves. It rushed over with a sword cry and ran onto the 4 seasons flying sword, refusing to leave. This immediately caused great repulsion from the 4 seasons flying sword. The flying sword flipped left and right in the waves, but it couldn't get rid of this burden on its body. This soaring god sword spirit jumped onto the 4 seasons flying sword, then jumped onto the Ju Cheng flying sword or hidden fragrance flying sword. It reaped without sowing. This made Lu Xiaoyi unable to help but have a thought. Since it liked to coexist with the other sword spirits on the same flying sword so much, then could it be that when it attacked, it could also have a spiritual attack attached to its power? This change needed to be slowly studied. But now, a good thing was that the sword spirits were surfing in the sword case. It was no longer like before in his sea of consciousness, where only the sword spirits were surfing. Instead, the sword spirits were surfing together with their flying swords, truly merging the sword spirits and the flying swords together. This provided a solid foundation for the improvement of his flying sword's attack power. One day in the future, when his own cultivation and the level of the flying sword reached a certain level, the flying sword and its sword spirit would completely merge into one, reaching the point where the flying sword would be the sword spirit, and the sword spirit would be the flying sword. The flying sword would be able to completely combine the physical form of the flying sword with the illusory form of the sword spirit. It could be nurtured in a physical form in the sword sheath, or it could exist in an illusory form in the sea of consciousness. However, to reach this step, at the very least, one had to start from Yuanying, which was too far away from the current Lu Xiaoyi. From this, it could be seen that the difference between the external sword and the internal sword was not that great. The problem was that one had to have the ability to reach that step. Following this, it didn't mean that he could get it done once and for all, and he didn't need to practice the sword anymore. But he could indeed use the success of the sword case to save precious time for himself. For example, he could let the 4 sword spirits lead their flying swords to surf endlessly in the sword box, while he could single-handedly stab the Big Dipper flying sword, the only one without a sword spirit, in order to gain experience in using the sword. It was troublesome to have too many flying swords because you didn't know which one to practice. One of the biggest uses of the Wei Sword Mountain sword case was to make the perfect choice for the cultivator. None of the flying swords should be left idle. and they should be used to the best of their abilities. This time, refining the sword case also gave him an important hint. Killing people was not the main reason for the creation of sword spirits. It might only be a part of it, but the root wasn't here. Then, how did he, an insignificant foreign sword cultivator, a plunderer from a low-level cultivation world, manage to do something that others thought was impossible? But to him, it was as if it was a piece of cake. Since he started cultivating, many strange things had happened to him. Before, his knowledge was limited and he didn't care, but now that his horizons were broadened, he thought more about some things. For example, the chasing luck in his sea of consciousness, what did it mean to him? Don't look at how lifeless it was on the surface, but he might not be able to see through the mysteries within. Another example, when he first entered Xinyuan to choose the sword pills, why did the sword pills avoid him? Was it a coincidence? Or was it inevitable? Such an obvious anomaly. Did the old ancestors of Xuanyuan's internal sword really not suspect it at all? He could easily create a sword spirit now. Did it have anything to do with these anomalies? Did the strange treatment he received at the Snow Dome Peak have anything to do with these? Things were a bit complicated. Chapter 380. Lu Xiaoyi had a rare few months of peace and quiet in Weijin Mountain. He had thought that he could stay here for a longer time, but Lan Cheng rushed into his simple cave a few days after he finished refining the sword case. This place was not qualified to be called a cave. Literally, the new 5-ring foundation establishment ranking list is out. Guess where you're ranked? Lu Xiaoyi said weakly. I hope I'm not in the top 1,000. That way, I won't have to deal with those endless troubles. That includes all of you. Lan Cheng was exultant. 11th. They probably think you haven't fought with the real experts on the ranking list yet, so you're in this position. If you work a little harder, you'll definitely enter the top 10. You defeated 9-3 Pure One's elites with one sword. I'm afraid only the top 10 can do that. Little E, you become famous overnight. You're famous. Lu Xiaoyi curled his lips. No sponsorship, no advertisement, and I'm still a pauper. Now, I even owe Marshal Uncle Enyi a favor. I heard he's already eating porridge. All I get is endless trouble and challenges. Lan Cheng, tell me, if the 1,000th person challenges me and I lose, will the rankings be reversed? Will they think I don't live up to my name? Will they kick me out of the ranking list forever if I'm just a person who fishes for fame? Lan Cheng shook his head. No, they'll only think that either your opponent cheated or you cheated. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. With his promise to Guangbei, it was only a matter of time before he entered the ranking list to fulfill Guangbei's wish. He only hoped to fight for the ranking list later when he was in the late or peak foundation establishment stage. After that, he could jump up and either form his gold core or die. It would be easier. Unlike now, he still had to wait for the opportunity to form his gold core from the middle to the peak. At least 100 years would be wasted in the endless drag of fame. It was too annoying. However, Lan Cheng gave a more pertinent suggestion. Little E, with your current position, it's easier to go up than down. Why don't you kill them so that they won't dare to challenge you again? This is easier than falling out of the ranking list. What he said seemed to make a lot of sense. The second person who came looking for him was Taoist Enyi. Little E, you should go back. At this time, it is not suitable for you to stay in Weijin Mountain. Lu Xiaoyi was puzzled. Why? Enyi smiled bitterly. Weijin Mountain's influence in Arai cannot be compared to Xuanyuan's influence in the western region. This is a fact, although we are not willing to admit it. As far as foundation building cultivators are concerned, in principle, we don't encourage them to cross regions. That's a matter for Jin Dan, not for foundation building cultivators who lack the ability to protect themselves. If you stay here, you will receive countless invitations. We can't refuse because swordsmen aren't afraid of death. But no one was unafraid of death, especially when it came to meaningless risks. If you don't understand this, you won't be able to go far on the road. Among these invitations, some are hostile, some are kind, and some have other intentions. We can't tell them apart at all. Weijin Mountain won't refuse. and as a famous swordsman, you can't refuse either. Thus, there will be countless uncontrollable situations. We can't send people to protect you forever. That's not the way of Weijian Mountain's swordsman, and it shouldn't be your way. So go back. Only in the dome, under the protection of Xian Yuan, can you obtain the most important space to grow. Lu Xiaoyi was stuffed into the teleportation formation on the same day and sent back to Xian Yuan. Inyu was a very competent and dedicated elder. After cultivating for hundreds of years, he was used to the miserable ending of those so-called geniuses who didn't know how to restrain themselves. When a top sect wants to scheme against you, they have countless ways to do it. They have all kinds of unimaginable methods to ensure that there is no trace of the matter and no one can use it against you. This was the difference between an individual and a group. To fight against such a power, it could only be another power, Xinyuan Sword Sect. Of course, Inyu didn't want Weijian Mountain to bear such pressure. In Arai, Weijian Mountain had always been at odds with the three pure ones. This was something that everyone could see. What they couldn't see was the careful consideration that Weijian Mountain had behind every confrontation. Swordsmen could pretend to be stupid, but they couldn't be brainless. If they didn't understand this, Weijian Mountain wouldn't have lived until now. Lu Xiaoyi came out for the other side and bowed to his martial uncle who operated the teleportation formation. Then, he quietly left Wangguang Peak and went back to his cave residence. His strength had increased, but his mentality hadn't caught up. He thought that if he didn't show off, people would forget about him. How could that be? This time, the person who invited him was Jin Dan from the Sword Qi Rushing Heaven Pavilion. The treatment was obviously different. I am Gu Ming. I am in charge of the management of the elite disciples in the Sword Qi Rushing Heaven Pavilion. From today onwards, everything you do will belong to the Rushing Heaven Pavilion. You don't have to listen to the orders of the other halls. Of course, being polite is one thing, but belonging is another. You have to be mentally prepared. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. This was a transfer of his file. He just didn't know if this transfer would bring more benefits, or would it bring more disadvantages. Gu Ming had a serious and businesslike attitude. However, Lu Xiaoyi wouldn't judge a person's likes and dislikes based on their appearance. He couldn't think that they were prejudiced just because they didn't smile at him. Yes, but I don't know what's the difference. I don't think I've come into contact with this before, so a jade scroll floated towards him. The details are all in here. You can go back and take a look. There's glory and benefits, but of course, there's also duty. Here, I am in charge of less than 50 elite outer sword disciples. Regardless of whether they are on the list or not, you are now ranked first among them. You are the eldest martial brother. As the eldest martial brother, you have to have the awareness of an eldest martial brother. In the future, if I'm not here, they will have to carry out your orders. Lu Xiaoyi shook his head so hard that it felt like it was flying. He no longer cared about his so-called elegance. No way, no way. How can I be the eldest martial brother? They are all seniors from the Yin and Guang generations, aren't they? Aren't you throwing me into a fire and roasting me? I can't be the eldest martial brother, but I can barely be the youngest martial brother. Actually, why don't you let me go back? This is too much. Gu Ming didn't give him a chance to decline. In Xinyuan, within the same realm, we only compare strength. We don't compare age, seniority, or whether we entered the sect earlier or later. It's been like this for tens of thousands of years. Can it change because of you? There are more than 20,000 Foundation Establishment disciples in the Outer Sword. Among them, there are more than 20 people who could be ranked on the 5-ring ranking. None of them are ranked within the top 100. You are ranked 11th. The difference is huge. If you don't become the eldest martial brother, who will? Lu Xiaoyi cried out in grievance. Martial uncle, this is fake. This is flattery. The three pure ones deliberately exaggerated the news and spread it. Don't tell me the sect can't even see through this? Think about it carefully. Let's not talk about the top 100. Even if it's the top 1,000, have I ever defeated a single one? There are no actual battle examples. It's all based on imagination. The purpose of setting it up so high is that someone wants to use it as a ladder. Chapter 381. Guming's expression didn't change. There are lies and there are truths. At the very least, I know that among the outer sword disciples on the ranking list, no one can single-handedly defeat 3 Pure One's elites with a single sword. Enough with the idle talk. The position of eldest senior brother is yours. There's no room for discussion. My outer sword branch hasn't obtained such a high ranking in over 1,000 years. How is it fake? If anyone disagrees, let them challenge the 3 Pure Ones themselves. Let me tell you, it's fine if you say these discouraging words in front of me, but you can't show your cowardice in front of outsiders, especially in front of those arrogant inner sword disciples. You have to hold your ground for me. This isn't just my wish. It's also the wish of the other disciples in the Rising Heaven Pavilion. It's also the wish of the martial uncles. Well, he had become the outer sword branch's golden fighter. In the future, when there were conflicts with the inner sword branch, there would be a lot of situations where he would be asked to stand up for them. It was really a case of sitting at home, but trouble came from the sky. Who would he find a reason with? Lu Xiaoyi knew he couldn't avoid it. Ever since the battle on Boating Island, the strategy of hiding his strength and biding his time no longer existed. Now, there were only two paths in front of him. Let nature take its course, or just advance triumphantly. Thus, he put forward his conditions. This was also the first time he had been so confident since coming to Xinyuan. He openly expressed his attitude. I'll do my best to fulfill your expectations. I won't be timid. However, I have a condition. Ever since I entered the sect, the missions have been too frequent. I haven't had enough time to improve my cultivation. Cultivation is the foundation of a cultivator. So, I ask that you give me 50 years of quiet time. After 50 years, I'll do whatever you want me to do. If you want me to go east, I won't go west. If you want me to beat a dog, I won't chase a chicken. Guming laughed angrily. 50 years? You really dare to say that? Are you using the dome as a place to retire? Why don't you ask for 100 years? Your cultivation isn't enough. This is the truth. It's not like the sect can't see it. We also know that your mission arrangements are dense. The sect isn't unreasonable. How about this? 20 years. 20 years from now, I want you to assume all the responsibilities of being the eldest senior brother of this generation of foundation establishment cultivators. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. He was already very satisfied. Originally, he thought that having 10 years of leisure time was already very good. 20 years, he thought that his cultivation level would be able to rise to another level, right? As long as his cultivation increased, his current strength would increase tremendously. This was inevitable. Guming changed his tone, but the 20 years I said, I won't arrange any missions for you. However, you still have to participate in some of the activities in the sect. You can't find excuses to decline. While you're at it, you should also rein in those junior brothers of yours. They might not necessarily submit to you now. 20 years later, some of the sect's secret missions will be handed over to you to complete. You have to understand that this isn't because the sect is oppressing you. If a jade isn't carved, it won't become useful. If a person isn't tempered, he won't progress. The so-called tempering is absolutely not just traveling around and enjoying yourself to your heart's content. You also need to be responsible and decisive when dealing with matters. There are many people who want this position, but the Soaring Heaven Pavilion won't give it to them. Sure enough, there were some tricks involved, but Lu Xiaoyi was already very satisfied. After all, the fights and entanglements in the sect weren't like those in the outside world. They were only fighting for spirit and face. There was always room to maneuver. Eldest senior brother cigarette, but was so strange. So strange. In Xinyuan, in fact, in almost every sect, there was a saying that the eldest senior brother was in charge. On one hand, it was because the martial uncles above were lazy. On the other hand, they really wanted to train the ability of the disciples below in advance. A snake wouldn't walk without a head, and a bird wouldn't fly without a head. A good leader was very useful to a team. The test was in all aspects of training. Of course, a super large sect like Xinyuan wouldn't only have one eldest senior brother in charge. He would be too busy. Below him, there was still the second senior brother, the third senior brother. In Xinyuan Sword School, there were 7 senior brothers in charge, but the eldest senior brother was the most important. Lu Xiaoyi was forced to do something beyond his ability. He didn't care about it. If he could avoid it, he would avoid it. However, there were some things he couldn't avoid. For example, the invitation from the other 6 swordsmen who had the title of senior brother. Since he was already the leader, he had to meet the brothers below him. The location of the gathering was on a nameless snowy peak. Lu Xiaoyi only got a location. Obviously, his future little brothers wanted to see his real strength now. They wanted to know if he really had the ability to fight off 9 3 Pure One's elites with one sword, or if it was just an exaggeration and a lie. In the world of cultivation, there was always a mixture of truth and falsehood. There was a group of people who specialized in fabricating rumors to cover up the truth. However, in this case, Dafo wasn't wrong. The fight was real, and the victory was real. However, there were some parts of it that people couldn't accept. For example, Lu Xiaoyi only killed the first 2 3 Pure One's cultivators. In fact, they were also the 2 weakest ones. This was the truth. The other 2 admitted defeat. The remaining 5 didn't even show up. Without seeing it with their own eyes, they couldn't really understand the actual situation of the battle. Another example was that none of the 9 3 Pure One's cultivators who showed up were on the ranking list. Although everyone admitted that there were hidden elites in every sect, and they weren't necessarily weak, there was no accurate standard to judge whether the ones who showed up were the elites of the elites, or just ordinary elites. Moreover, in the eyes of the sword cultivators, there was a deep-rooted belief that one had to pull out a mule or a horse to see if one was a mule or a horse. The so-called elites that emerged from within the sect through acting were actually different from those on the leaderboard who relied on their own strength to fight their way up. The Xinyuan swordsmen paid particular attention to actual combat. They were very clear that the same level didn't determine the same ability. There were too many other factors in a battle. Judgment, experience, psychological quality, courage, and the ability to seize opportunities were often more important than how high one's cultivation was or how many types of swordsmanship one knew. Lu Xiaoyi's problem was that he had never really defeated a person on the ranking list. It was really hard for people to believe that he was in such a high position. It wasn't just the external swordsman sect. In fact, many cultivators from other sects also had doubts about this. This was the trouble of being on the ranking list. If you were ranked too low, people would look down on you. If you were ranked too high, people wouldn't be convinced. The ranking list was really not a good thing. He knew that in order to solve this problem, just like what Lan Sheng of the Weijin Mountains said, it was impossible to keep a low profile. There was no room for a low profile unless you looked down on the other mountains, beat them until they didn't even have the courage to challenge. In this place, words were useless. Flying swords were the real thing. It was useless to form cliques and win people over with virtue. The 6 of them were standing on a huge rock with a radius of more than 100 feet on the top of the snowy peak. Snow was falling, and the north wind was howling. The clothes of the 6 of them were fluttering like 6 long swords, standing still in the wind and snow. They had already felt a spiritual opportunity approaching. That must be the so-called eldest senior brother. They had also thought of countless ways to measure the quality of this new eldest senior brother. If he wasn't as good as the rumors said he was, they were afraid that they would laugh. However, this figure didn't come close to them. What came close to them was a sword light. It split the wind and snow apart. The majestic momentum created an obvious path in the wind and snow. Near the path was a light. When they saw it, it was already in front of them. Chapter 382. It was already too late for them to draw their swords to defend themselves. This person's intention was far beyond their expectations. The distance of the sword was also not within their knowledge. If they were to draw their swords to defend themselves, they would not be able to use their swords. They could only suffer in silence. The 6 of them were all experienced swordsmen. From the momentum of the flying sword, they could tell that it was unrivaled. However, there was one thing that was different. That person's spiritual sense was not locked onto them. In other words, this was just a show of strength. The 6 of them quickly got up. Just as they were about to leave the boulder, the sword light slashed horizontally beneath their feet. The sharpness of the sword light caused the boulder to be sliced in half because they had lost their footing, and because of the huge impact, the 2 halves of the boulder fell downwards. But who knew that the sword light would turn around and return? The sword light flashed again, and the 2 halves of the boulder were sliced into 4. The sword light disappeared, and at the foot of the snowy peak, the sound of 4 boulders falling to the ground could be heard. The snowstorm continued to rage, as if the killing intent of the sword light had never appeared. Apart from the empty stone pit at the top of the snowy peak, there was still an innocent boulder here. There was no trace of the person. Apart from the howling of the snowstorm, there was nothing else suspicious. Eldest senior brother had come, used his sword to speak to them, and then left. They could not answer this question. They could not connect. There were 3 meanings in this sentence. The sword had a range of 400 zhong, and they were unable to use their swords at this distance. Even third senior brother, who had the longest range, could only reach a range of 300 zhong. The sharpness of the sword that had sliced through the boulder was enough to send chills down their spines. Even second senior brother, who had the strongest swordsmanship among them, could only slice through half of the boulder. It was impossible for him to slice it in half so easily. The sword slashed back. This meant that the person was still able to control the flying sword as he wished from 400 zhong away. This kind of control was enough to send one into despair. It meant that even if he wanted to attack you, he could always stay out of your range of attack, causing you to be unable to retaliate. Among the 6 of them, second senior brother, who was previously eldest senior brother, had an awkward expression on his face. He exchanged glances with the other junior brothers, and they had already given up on the thought of challenging eldest senior brother. The 6 of them were all outstanding talents of the Thousand Elegance Peaks outer swordsman. Among them, second senior brother was ranked 1st and 2nd, third senior brother was ranked 15th and 15th, and the other 4 were all ranked in the top 300 of the Foundation establishment roll. Among the external swords, this was already a very good ranking. They had climbed up step by step through many years of hardship and struggle, without a trace of luck. It was also because of this that they had serious doubts about the qualifications of the newly promoted eldest senior brother, but it was also reasonable. Monks, especially swordsmen, value real battles the most. There are many low-key swordsmen on the dome. They can do everything they can in sword simulation, but they know that a real battle of life and death is different from sword simulation. However, there was no one in the dome peak who could completely crush them. Today, a senior brother had jumped out and completely shattered their pride. The sword was heavy and far. If you were to torture them from afar, how many swords could they withstand? The distance between monks was controlled. If the distance was within a few hundred feet, then they could use escape techniques, battle tactics, and other methods to make up for it. It would not be impossible for them to reach it in battle. However, if the distance was within a few hundred feet, then it meant that the opponent could practically beat them up continuously, and it would be very difficult to use battle tactics to close in. This was the most troublesome problem for them. Even with their rich experience, they were unable to do anything in such a simple distance. It made them feel melancholy. Perhaps in a different environment, they might have a chance to fight. However, in the space of a duel, there was no way to deal with a long-distance heavy sword. Looks like our eldest senior brother still has some tricks up his sleeve. At least among us, no one dares to say that they can beat him. However, I still doubt his ranking in the 11th place. If he were to fight against a top-notch Dharma cultivator, they have many special methods. Our eldest senior brother's expertise may not be enough. Third senior brother laughed self-deprecatingly. They did not expect that their fellow disciples would not be able to prove that their eldest senior brother did not live up to his name. Instead, they had to rely on those annoying Dharma cultivators to burst this bubble. They had been on the ranking list for a long time and knew the depth of its depths, especially the top 30. Every one of them had their own unique skills. If they were only able to shoot far and kill hard, Then, in the eyes of the ever-changing top-notch Dharma cultivators, it was a stupid skill. Second senior brother sighed. Uncle Master Gu Ming said that he would only come out to truly take charge of various affairs 20 years later. Right now, he's just a figurehead. Let's carry on as usual. Let's just wait and see what earth-shaking changes will happen 20 years later. Everyone agreed. They could not be blamed for feeling repulsed. This was inevitable due to the length of their lifespans. They were all over 100 years old, and the oldest among them, fifth senior brother, was even over 150 years old. It was indeed difficult for them to accept calling a 60 or 70-year-old eldest senior brother. If a swordsman was dissatisfied, he would settle it with his sword. They knew that they could not do the same as eldest senior brother's sword move, so they were not qualified to challenge him. However, this did not mean that they could not find other opportunities to challenge him in the next 20 years. A figurehead was still a figurehead. One had to take responsibility for it. Liu Xiaoyi obtained rare time to concentrate on cultivation. This time, he placed his main plan on improving his cultivation. Cultivation was like this. It was a process of constantly making up for one's shortcomings. When one first entered the sect, they felt that their state was not stable, so they focused on improving their cultivation. Later on, when their cultivation was stable, they felt that their swordsmanship was not enough. They were afraid that they would be killed when they went out, so they worked hard on their swordsmanship. Now that their swordsmanship had reached a certain level, they looked back and realized that their cultivation was holding them back again. So they started to make up for it again. This situation would continue. When his state was high, there were still many shortcomings to be made up for. Not only cultivation and swordsmanship, but also spirit, understanding of Tao state, mystery exploration, body technique, and so on. When he had made up for all of them, he would probably become an immortal. But how many people could do it? Liu Xiaoyi divided each day into a few parts. The most important part was the Big Dipper scripture. Other than the 2 hours in the morning and the 2 hours in the morning, he also arranged for 2 hours in the spirit gathering formation to force himself to accept spirits. Out of the 24 hours in a day, he had taken away 8 hours. Other than that, he also planned to practice a few more practical skills to make up for the lack of swordsman skills. Battles were ever-changing, and so were situations. One sword alone could not do everything. Perhaps one day, he would be able to break 10,000 skills with a single sword. However, it was definitely not now. Every day, he would take out 4 hours to practice his swordsmanship in the Nine Palace realm. Not only did he have the Big Dipper flying sword, he also had a newly carved rain flying sword. This was so that he could prepare at least 2 flying swords that could turn into spirits. His choice was very practical. He did not care about those powerful lightning, space, and the 5 elements. The reason why he chose the rain-flying sword was because Yin Yi once told him that 7 out of 10 swordsmen's battles would be in the sky, and 2 out of 10 would be in the water. The rest of his special battles would only add up to 1 stop. Therefore, as a swordsman, it was very practical to have a water-type flying sword. Chapter 383. Ling Ruofeng led a group of junior brothers and sisters to a beginner stage below Thousand Elegance Peak, sweating profusely. Xin Yuan had 20,000 external swords, but the majority of them were always at the beginner stage. If one were to look at those elite and outstanding disciples, it would seem that their cultivation realm was never a problem, nor was their swordsmanship a problem. As time passed, their cultivation realm increased, and their swordsmanship improved, as if it was a matter of course. But if one were to look at the group as a whole, the cruelty of the cultivation world would truly show itself. Not everyone could easily advance from the early stage of foundation establishment to the middle stage, to the later stage, or even to the peak stage. Not everyone could complete the engraving and refining of a flying sword in a few years, or even dozens of years, and then begin the refining of the next flying sword. For many cultivators, the middle stage was a hurdle, and the later stage was an even bigger hurdle. There were many who could not reach the great circle of foundation establishment. It was the same for swordsmanship. There were many disciples who could not even master a single flying sword after a few decades. This was a common phenomenon in cultivation. There were always people coming in, and there were always people leaving. When you were unable to raise your cultivation realm and had no talent in swordsmanship, after a few decades of suffering, cultivators would inevitably seek another direction for themselves. My heart is for the Tao. My heart is for the sword, and I will not regret it even in death. After all, such people were rare. Swordsmen had always been a tradition with a very low success rate, and this had never changed. Therefore, the beginner stage was always the majority, and it was always overcrowded. The Ice Lake stage was one of the most famous beginner stages. It had a wide view and beautiful scenery, attracting countless swordsmen. It was also the most popular place for beginner disciples to train their swordsmanship, and it was hard to find a single one. A total of 20 battle arenas were lined up in a row. The winner would stay and the loser would leave. There were many cultivators. Often, after being defeated in a battle, they would have to line up for another 2 hours before they could get the chance to fight again. Waiting was torturous, but there were also some who did not have to wait long. For example, there were 2 stages in the east where 10 swordsmen were gathered around. They were either fighting one-on-one or in pairs and were having a great time. A cultivator said with dissatisfaction, "So the stage can be reserved? How come I didn't know there was such a rule?" A cultivator beside him said with disdain, "There's no such thing as reserved. It's just that he has a powerful backer behind him that we can't afford to offend." The cultivator straightened his neck. "Thigh, we swordsmen compete to see whose sword is faster, whose sword is more vicious, and who has more tricks up their sleeves. I've never heard of a competition of thighs. I also know a few martial brothers who have elders in high positions in Xinyuan, but I don't see them being spoiled and arrogant. How thick was this thigh? So crude that many people are afraid of it." A cultivator in the know laughed. "His legs aren't that thick. He's just a foundation establishment cultivator like us. But his legs are formidable because they're in the right place. There are over 10,000 disciples under the Thousand Elegance Peak. Regardless of whether it is missions, arrangements, rewards, punishments, or excursions, the Thousand Elegance Peak has a say in everything. From a certain perspective, the Thousand Elegance Peak is even more in control than the various halls. Tell me, if you offended such an existence while you were at the bottom of the Thousand Elegance Peak, would you accept it or not?" Seeing that the cultivator was still in a daze, the person in the know sighed. The Foundation Establishment eldest senior brother of Thousand Grace Peak. He's ranked 11th on the list of 5-ring Foundation Establishment cultivators. In the past several thousand years, he's the expert closest to the top 10 of our Xuanyuan's external sword lineage. Tell me, who would dare ignore his legs? Who could ignore it? You have to know that eldest senior brother has only been in the sect for 30 years. He had already reached this stage. If he were to enter the sect for 100 years, oh no, after 100 years, he might not even be in the Foundation Establishment realm anymore. In just another 30 years, he would definitely have a place in the top 10. Do you think you can offend such a character just because you want to? This insider was a person who only believed in the rankings. He was proud of the glory of his family's external sword, but he would not investigate how the rankings came about and whether it was justified or not. However, there were also those who were more serious, or perhaps those who were jealous, who immediately stood up to refute. 11 is the ranking board's own words. Let's not talk about whether or not he has fought with the top 10 experts. Even if he has fought with those after that, have any of you heard of his battle record? I personally think that the 99% in the upper realm is still reliable, but to jump up 1,000 ranks in just 3 years doesn't conform to the laws of cultivation. Right now, this ranking is ridiculous and has no basis at all. I, Xinyuan, raise my cultivation through battle and am not afraid of challenges. This is something that can be won with strength, so why would I use unorthodox methods? Does Xinyuan lack such a ranking? Thus, whether or not he is eldest senior brother still needs time to prove. I don't think so. When his bubble in the sect is exposed, it will be the moment he loses face on the ranking board. Right now, these people are so complacent that they think they are eldest senior brother's fellow cultivators. It won't be long before they spit out all the advantages they have gained. The higher they stand, the harder they fall. They will become the laughingstock of Thousand Elegance Peak. Originally, it was about the distribution of the sword battle arena, but in the end, it was about whether or not eldest senior brother was justified. However, the latter question was obviously more attractive. Many cultivators who were waiting for the sword battle arena to battle gathered around. How could the person who knew the truth from before be willing to take this lying down? There's no use in talking about this. The ranking board has been able to establish its reputation in the fifth ring for tens of thousands of years. It has grown bigger and bigger because of its accuracy, not because of blind guesses. Regardless of whether it was the previous 9, or the current 11, there is a reason behind it. Let me ask you one thing. If 10 of you, Hi Huzi, were tied together, would you dare to say that you killed the 9 elite cultivators of the 3 pure ones until they didn't dare to show their faces? Are you looking for evidence? You have to have the qualifications first. If you don't know, then it doesn't count. Say that again when you become a nascent soul or a monarch. With your current conduct, is there anything in the fifth ring that requires you to nod your head to prove? Unorthodox methods? What right do you have to say that? Just because you didn't see it with your own eyes? Feeling the urge to insult others, the insider began to shoot his mouth off. It's normal for people to have doubts. However, it's not our turn. Which of those senior brothers in front of us is willing to have someone ride on their heads? Why haven't they said anything in the past half a year? They didn't even challenge the sword battle arena? Or do they know that it's useless to try? What do you mean by Xian Yuan lacks a ranking? Hey, go and look at Xuan Yuan's history. Xian Yuan has many such honors. Because they have the inner sword, do we have the outer sword? If not for eldest senior brother standing up for us this time, the outer sword wouldn't even be in the top 100. Yet you still want to vent your energy and weaken yourself here. The reason the outer sword is so weak is because there are too many people like you. Many people think that the outer sword is the inner sword's follower. When the inner sword has a strong opponent, they applaud and think that it's right and proper. When they have a strong opponent, they feel discouraged and pick on them in every possible way. Don't be an outer sword. Just be a concubine. How could Hai Huzi stand this person's sarcasm? In an instant, they were in a mess. There were also countless people who used underhanded methods, black fists, and tripping. Fortunately, no one dared to use their inner sword. Chapter 384. Similar disputes could be found everywhere in the external Sword Foundation establishment group. Ever since the appearance of the new generation's big senior brother, doubt and support had been the eternal melody. It had never subsided. Without a doubt, the group of cultivators who were mainly foreign cultivators were the ones who supported the external Sword Foundation. Their own camp had produced a powerful figure, so they had to support it. As for the doubts, since the ranking board had acknowledged it, there was no need to compare. The main ones who were suspicious were the local cultivators of the Fifth Ring Mountain. They could not accept the fact that outsiders were stronger than them. On the other hand, the cultivators from Xuanyuan's hometown, Qingkong, were mostly neutral. They did not flatter or discredit the outsiders. They only cultivated proudly, regardless of the changes in the world. Senior sister, get one. It's very beneficial to flying swords. It's much better than Xuanyuan's. There was a huge commotion outside, but Lu Xiaoi turned a deaf ear to it. He showed senior sister Yin Cheng the sword case he got from Weijin Mountain. Yin Chong was very envious, but she knew that she did not have a chance. In terms of strength, there were countless swordsmen in Xianyuan who were stronger than her. She could not achieve as much as Lu Xiaoi. Furthermore, she did not have a chance to go to Arai. It was not her turn. We swordsmen are not attached to objects, Lu Xiaoi interrupted her. Okay. Senior sister, let's not talk about these principles in private. Okay? What is an object? Is a flying sword not an object? Is a sword pill not? Why do you have to be so stubborn? As long as senior sister calls me big senior brother, when I come out of seclusion, I will definitely bring you to a rye. I have a relationship with a foolish martial uncle from Weijin Mountain. Yin Chang looked at him seriously. Junior brother, you want to be senior brother? That's impossible, Lu Xiaoyi laughed. He did not have the addiction of big senior brother, but the more senior sister resisted, the more excited he became. With a shake of his body, he had transformed from a little hen into a golden phoenix. Only his two friends in Xinyuan were not surprised. All kinds of miraculous things about this kid had shown signs as early as 5 years ago in the Wolf Ridge. Now that the young eagle had spread its wings, nothing could stop him. Yinbo didn't come to see him. He was still putting on airs as a senior brother. He didn't know if the power of an external sword big brother was useful in front of an internal sword. It probably wasn't useful. Yinbo was hurt. He had a premonition that he couldn't beat this former junior brother, so he might as well not see him. Smokey didn't care. She didn't have Yinbo's inexplicable self-esteem. She always treated Lu Xiaoyi as her junior brother, no matter how strong he was now. Is there anything you need to do outside? You're too big of a target now. There will be a lot of trouble outside. If there's anything you need to deal with, Yinbo and I can go on a trip for you. Anyway, we're basically running around outside and rarely have time to stop. Yinbo and Smoky Chong were close to the great circle of foundation establishment, so for their current situation, cultivation wasn't important. What was important was that they could achieve a breakthrough in their temperament through experience and some kind of key opportunity. There were foundation establishment pills for foundation establishment, but there were no Jindan pills for Jindan. There were many mysterious variables, and there were no rules to follow. Lu Xiaoyi pretended to ponder. I have a second uncle. I haven't seen him for decades. I don't know if his whole family is dead or alive. I'll have to trouble you to go to the lower 3-star body. It's not far, about 100 years. You don't have to report to me. Just burn some incense. Smoky Chong raised her hand and hit him. Lu Xiaoyi jumped far away and laughed. I'm all alone. What personal matters do I have to deal with? Senior sister, why are you worried about this? On the other hand, when you reach Weijin Mountain, you have to think about how to get a sword case. I have an idea. There are a lot of bachelors in Weijin Mountain. Why don't you just marry over? Then you'll have everything. There weren't many happy days and gatherings. Even Ling Ruofeng's group didn't dare to invite him. He was no longer the unknown junior brother, but the eldest senior brother of more than 20,000 foundation establishment swordsmen in Xianxiu Peak. There was a huge difference between them. Lu Xiaoyi didn't think that he was that different, but in the eyes of others, the change in status meant a lot. They weren't close friends. Slowly, they would fade away. He wouldn't deliberately make friends with others, and others wouldn't flatter him blindly. That was it. 3 years later, he didn't participate in the Xianyuan external sword competition. In fact, not only did he not participate, even second senior brother, third senior brother, and all the people on the ranking list didn't participate. To experienced and knowledgeable cultivators, the competition between swordsmen and swordsmen didn't mean much. They used the same philosophy, similar systems, similar tactics, and the same fearless style. In the end, it was a competition to see whose flying sword could carve the most sword formations, be faster, and be heavier. The real mirror to measure a swordsman was a Dharma cultivator. Unfortunately, Dharma cultivators wouldn't be so free as to be their whetstone. 5 years later, a group of external swordsmen from Weijin Mountain came to Xianyuan for an exchange. Lu Xiaoyi didn't participate as well. Perhaps they were reminded by the higher-ups of Weijin Mountain, but the arrogant Weijin Mountain didn't propose to compete with Lu Xiaoyi. They only taught the external swordsmen from Xianyuan a lesson like they did every time they came, including second senior brother. The sword aura rushing Heaven Pavilion was happy to see this. It helped the external swordsmen from Xianyuan to recognize their own strength. They didn't want to use Xuanyuan's name to swagger around outside. The martial uncles from the Rushing Heaven Pavilion seemed to have forgotten about Lu Xiaoyi. They had the same problem as the elders from Weijin Mountain, Jindan, They didn't forget about him, but they were afraid of both sides. Xian Yuan was afraid that if this unreliable eldest senior brother lost, the morale of the external swordsman from Xian Yuan would drop again. They had already treated Lu Xiaoyi as a benchmark, a name card. It didn't matter if he could fight or not. He was ranked here, so he was the target of publicity. Weijin Mountain knew that they couldn't win, so they didn't mention it. No one would travel thousands of miles to get beaten up, so it was better to avoid him. During this time, there were countless gatherings of young experts in the Western region. There were gatherings between those on the ranking list, those below the ranking list, those between friendly forces, those with bad intentions, those with generous rewards, and so on. Almost every gathering was specially invited to the Foundation establishment eldest senior brother from Xuanyuan's external swordsman. But the sword aura rushing heaven pavilion used all kinds of excuses to reject them. On this point, Gu Ming had really done what he had promised him. But this time, he couldn't hide anymore. Gu Ming personally sent him a message through the sword talisman, asking him to prepare. Prepare for the upcoming confrontation between Xuanyuan's external swordsmen. This was an ancient and long-lasting tradition. It was different from the small fight between Lu Xiaoyi and the internal swordsman last time. That was a show of strength by a Foundation establishment newbie, so it didn't mean anything. This time, newbies and veterans weren't qualified to participate in the confrontation. Those who were qualified to participate were the people on the ranking list of the internal and external swordsmen. No matter if you were ranked 1st or 1,000, no one could hide. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.